Chapter 504. In this world, the human heart was the most unpredictable thing. Most of the time, you would think that you already knew a person's character and behavior very well. But on a certain day, or when something unexpected happened, you would often see some other deeply hidden things that would shock you and make you feel incredulous. Or perhaps there would be a feeling that the past did not seem real. This kind of thing happened to many people. Some people revealed it, and some people might not have the opportunity to do so in their entire lives. As for whether it was right or wrong, good or bad, it was up to each person to have their own opinions. However, there was a kind of person who was particularly eye-catching when it came to this kind of thing, because this kind of huge change was bound to happen to them. They were patient, tenacious, lurking, and even wearing masks, living a familiar life. But one day, they suddenly threw away their masks, tore off their disguise, and revealed their true colors. Then, they caused pain and shock to everyone around them. This kind of person had a dark and mysterious code name in Zhenxiaming and Fuyunji called the Shadow. And in the secular world, there was a more common and vulgar and contemptuous name called the Traitor. Until now, Lu Chun and the others had already discovered that Chun he was a very complicated person. He could be loyal to the so-called God sect and would rather die than submit, but he could also turn hostile and ruthless in the blink of an eye. Moreover, Chun did not think that he was a traitor. He had his own opinion on this kind of thing. He felt that what Lu Chun had done in the past was a traitor, and he himself had been forced to make this choice when he was at the end of his rope. He felt that he did not disappoint the world or the earth. After all, he had suffered so much for the God sect, but he was still loyal and unyielding. However, those who he had repaid with his life had repaid him by harming his family. This was intolerable. He had no choice but to rely on Zhenxiaming and Fuyunji. It was all those bastards' fault. Of course, the man named Lu Chun had done a lot of things during this period, and his methods were not honorable. However, Chun he was very smart and did not hold a grudge against him. He was the only descendant of the famous Lord Tianlan, and also a new noble in Zhenxiaming. He was an important person who held great power, including the life and death of his whole family. For such a person, he only needed to serve him loyally. It was useless to think about dissatisfaction and resentment. Moreover, his wife had said many good things about Lu Chun. In short, after Chun he put down the knot in his heart and relied on Zhenxiaming. He immediately became a person who could adapt to circumstances. Since he had already decided to rely on Lu Chun, he quickly began to show his ability in front of Lu Chun. He began to lead Lu Chun, Shui Ying, and Fuyunji's men to hunt down the remaining evil sect members and the remaining well-hidden spies in the huge immortal city. Yes, even after experiencing so many storms, there were still remnants of the devil sect in the immortal city. This sect that had been passed down for thousands of years still had a deep foundation, and there were still people secretly lurking in the shadows that no one knew about. However, Chun he was not an ordinary follower of the evil sect. His identity was extremely special. He was a messenger that was recently groomed by Elder Ghost. In the immortal city, he had a status that was second only to one and above tens of thousands. In other words, he knew far more secrets about the evil sect than most people. And this time, Chun he seemed to have gone all out. Once he turned hostile, he was even more ruthless and ruthless than the people of Fuyunji. He mercilessly killed his former comrades, with an attitude of not leaving a single blade of grass behind. Thus, in the immortal city, Fuyunji stirred up another reign of terror. That year, the number of people killed by Fuyunji in the immortal city was said to be unprecedented. Although it was not as exaggerated as a bloodbath, but many people in many places could smell the thick stench of blood. Then, in broad daylight, they saw some ordinary people being dragged out of their homes. Some were beaten up, some were killed on the streets. Then, to the onlookers who looked at each other in shock, they loudly announced that these were the remnants of the evil sect. To show his loyalty, Chun he took the lead in front of Lu Chun and Shui Ying, and even personally killed 5 to 6 people. He was very heavy-handed, and his methods were very fierce. He looked as if he was afraid that others would think that he did not hate the evil sex sorcerers. Lu Chun and Old Ma had been doing these things for the past few days. They had seen all of Chun He's methods. Most of the time, the two of them did not make a move. The ones charging in front were Chun He and the fierce elites of Fuyunji. They found a place to watch. Old Ma said to Lu Chun in a low voice, "Why do I feel that there is something wrong with this person's heart?" Lu Chun looked forward. His expression did not change. He also lowered his voice and said, "Don't talk nonsense. He is doing things for us." Old Ma sneered and shook his head. "I heard that he still thinks that he has a clear conscience." Lu Chun glanced at him and frowned. "Come on, Chun He has only chosen his own path. Naturally, he has to walk on this path. What's so strange about that?" Old Ma snorted and did not say more about these things. He changed the topic and asked, "Isn't the most important thing now to catch that old tortoise? Why do we keep catching these small fries?" Lu Chun said, "First, these are not small fries. They have hidden themselves so deeply. If it wasn't for Chun He, it would be almost impossible for us to dig them out. And after these people are dug out, the situation that the evil sect has been operating in the Immortal City for many years will almost completely collapse. This is very important. Secondly, Elder Ghost is cunning and suspicious. But no matter how he hides his tracks, he is like a mouse. He will always have a territory network. We are cutting off the blocked passages one by one. As long as that old tortoise still insists on not leaving the Immortal City. If this goes on, there will soon be a day where he has nowhere to escape to." Old Ma nodded. He did not seem to have much of an objection to Lu Chen's deduction. But after a moment, he suddenly asked curiously, "Say, why do you think that old tortoise Elder Ghost has been refusing to leave the Immortal City for so many years?" Lu Chen's eyes flashed slightly and said, "There should be some secret in this big city that attracts him." The two of them looked at each other. After a moment, they suddenly looked down at their feet at the same time. The ground was thick and flat. It extended all the way into the distance. Screams sounded in front of them. Blood splattered everywhere. Fresh blood flowed out from the dead bodies, staining the ground red and seeping into the soil. In the depths of the underground labyrinth, the blood moon flickered a few times. It seemed to be a little unstable, but soon calmed down again. It emitted a strange blood-red light, shining on the empty and strange city below. After staying here for a few days, Supreme Gu left today. After all, in the light of the blood moon, it had a lot of bad effects on the cultivators. He needed to take a break for a while. He, a spirit-severing perfected lord, was already like this. The other cultivators of the Starry Hall were naturally affected even more. So after many days, there were much fewer people busy here. At a glance, in the city in the bloodlight, there were probably less than 20 Starry Hall cultivators working. Compared to this huge city, the number of people was really pitiful. It could be said that there were almost none. It was also under such circumstances, in a quiet house not far from the statue in the center of the city, in a well that had long dried up in the backyard, a light patter suddenly sounded. After a moment, at the bottom of the dark well, a secret door made of a large piece of stone slowly opened. Chapter 505. The mechanism of the secret door was very intricately made. The stone used to make the secret door was not light, but when it was moved, it was almost silent. No one knew which skilled craftsman made it. The dry well was very deep, narrow at the top, and wide at the bottom. Looking up from the bottom of the well, there seemed to be only a narrow sky. The sky was still blood-red. The bright red light of the blood moon could not reach the bottom of the deep dry well, so it was shrouded in darkness. When a dark figure slowly walked out of the darkness, he looked like a ghost. There was a faint light in the darkness. When the figure slowly raised his head, he found that the light was actually a strange fluorescence emitted from his eyes. He raised his head and looked at the small hole high up, as if he was thinking about something. With the help of the weak light, one could vaguely see that the mysterious figure's face was covered with a sinister and strange mask. The next moment, the light suddenly disappeared. The figure stood in the darkness, motionless, like a piece of rotten wood that had been standing there for many years, lifeless. After a while, on the high ground, there was a sudden sound of light footsteps. Then it seemed that there were two people talking and walking over from not far away. No one approached the lifeless, ordinary, dry well. They did not even take a second look at it. When the footsteps gradually disappeared, the mysterious masked man in the darkness slowly opened his eyes again. The strange fluorescence appeared in the darkness again. He looked coldly at the hole leading to the outside, as if he was deep in thought. "How have you been doing recently?" Supreme Tianlong looked at Lu Chun and asked. At this moment, in the quiet hall of Kunlun, Supreme Tianlong and Lu Chun sat opposite each other. There was no one else around, and both of them were very relaxed. Leaning against the originally solemn lotus throne, Lu Chun held a wine jar in his hand and drank from it from time to time. After hearing Tianlong's words, Lu Chun put down the wine jar in his hand and said, "It's not bad. After Chun he defected to us, he led us to dig out many spies of the evil cult. Except for Elder Ghost, we have basically wiped out the evil cult's forces in Immortal City." As he said that, he paused for a moment before continuing. "Also, during this period of time, the cooperation with the Floating Clouds Company has been going well. However, it won't be that fast. After all, they're all proud soldiers that you personally trained. It won't be that easy for them to submit to you. Anyway, let's wait for a few more days. They're probably slowly accepting me." Supreme Tianlong nodded, looking quite satisfied, and said, "You did better than I thought. It seems that my judgment is not bad. At least I didn't misjudge you all these years." Lu Chun clicked his tongue twice, raised his head, and took a big gulp of wine. After swallowing it, he said leisurely, "Actually, it's all thanks to you that I have a backer. When I have nothing to do, I will use you to boost my courage and pressure others. From time to time, I will remind the people of the Floating Clouds Agency that I have you backing me. I am also your only disciple, the future successor of the Foundation. If they don't cooperate with me or don't listen to my orders, I will immediately come back to complain. So, they're probably still afraid of you, so they have no choice but to obey me like this." Supreme Tianlong was startled for a while. Then he laughed and slapped his knee. He said with a smile, "Kid, you are indeed black-hearted and thick-skinned. Won't you anger Shui Ying and the others to death by doing this?" Lu Chun said, "That won't happen. I have always respected Home Master Shui Ying and rarely use my power to bully people. I always discuss things calmly. It's only because her subordinates are used to being arrogant that I use this method." Supreme Tianlong smiled and seemed to be in a good mood. He pointed at Lu Chun and said with a smile, "You are probably the only person in the world who dares to do this. How did those people react after you used your power to bully them?" Lu Chun thought for a while and couldn't help but laugh. He said, "Probably disgusted, but have no choice but to give in. It's quite fun." As he said this, he looked at Supreme Tianlong and said, "What's wrong? Do you think there's a problem with this method? If you really think it's inappropriate, then I won't use it in the future." Supreme Tianlong rolled his eyes and said, "Use it. Continue using it for me. As long as it's effective, use it." Lu Chun seemed to have expected him to say that, so he was not surprised. He just smiled and raised the wine jar to perfected Lord Tianlong to show his respect and gratitude. Then, he continued to drink. True Lord Tianlong didn't care that his disciple had no scruples in front of him. He continued, "If you really follow the rules of this old man's foundation, just like the disciples of the Kunlun sect, who are so serious that they look like saints, it would be strange if you can do anything well in this old man's foundation. Even if I pass the foundation to you in the future, it will probably fail in a few years at most." Lu Chun coughed and reminded Supreme Tianlong, "Don't forget, you are the Grand Emperor and old ancestor of the Kunlun party. Watch your words." Supreme Tianlong glared at him and said, "Bullsh asterisk T. I've been cultivating and fighting for my entire life. Can't I even say something now?" Lu Chun was speechless. After a while, he waved his hand and said helplessly, All right. You're a soul formation perfected lord. You're amazing. You can indeed say whatever you want." Perfected Lord Tianlong chuckled. "Of course, There was no real anger in his eyes when he looked at Lu Chun. Instead, there was a hint of admiration and gratification. Kid, work hard. I have high hopes for you. Lu Chun rolled his eyes and couldn't help but shudder. What do you mean by that? Do you feel like you've encountered something and you want to make arrangements for your funeral? That's scary. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud with an extremely carefree expression. He then said proudly, "Who in the world can go against me?" Lu Chun also laughed and looked at the damn baldy with a strange gaze. After a while, he sighed and said, "I say, I've been drinking all day today. Why do I feel like you're a little drunk? I'm happy that I have a great future ahead of me," Supreme Tianlan said, "but now, it seems like you're the only one I can chat with in the world. It's the right decision to take you in as my disciple. We've barely seen each other in the past 10 years. Now we can often have a chance to chat alone like this. It's not bad." Lu Chun was slightly surprised. He looked at Supreme Tianlan as if he didn't expect such a high and mighty figure to say something like that to him. However, were those words from the bottom of his heart? Should he believe it? Lu Chun didn't know. He only saw that the person in front of him was living a happy life and had an intimidating aura. He was at the peak of a person's life, and even Lu Chun couldn't help but feel respect for him. If there were no gods in the world, then Supreme Tianlan should be the person closest to a demigod right now, right? If there were God in the world, such as those worshipped by the devil's sex, then this damn baldy would probably be the person who had the highest chance of defeating them. It was probably no wonder that he was so arrogant given how talented and powerful he was and how he looked down on the world. As he was thinking, he suddenly heard Supreme Tianlan ask him again, "By the way, I heard that you've been drinking more and more recently. Is there something wrong with you?" Lu Chun was stunned and suddenly frowned. "How did you know about that? Could it be that old Ma told you?" Chapter 506. Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, "You're just like a drunkard. Everyone can see how you're drinking when you're free. Why do you need him to tell me?" Lu Chun heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Don't worry. It's just that I've been fond of drinking recently. It won't cause any trouble, and it won't harm my body. Of course, I won't become addicted to alcohol. In all these years, there haven't been any cultivators who ruined their cultivation because of alcohol, right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment and said, "That's true. However, things like alcohol and women are ultimately not beneficial to cultivation. Excessive drinking is also harmful. Even if others see it and talk about it behind your back, it's not appropriate for you. You should drink less." Lu Chun snorted and said, "Just now, you were acting like you didn't care about anything in the world. Why is it that when it comes to me, you suddenly have to care about how other people look at you?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "You're not a soul formation perfected lord, so you don't have to think about these things." Lu Chun was speechless. After a while, he waved his hand and said, Fine. You're good. I think there's a saying that's very suitable for the current situation. Do you know what it is?" Old Ma asked Lu Chun with a smile. It seemed like another day had passed. It was dusk. They were walking on the mountainside of Sky Dragon Mountain. The sun was setting and the sky was filled with the afterglow. It looked very beautiful. "Catch a turtle in a jar?" Lu Chun said without turning his head. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled and said, "That's exactly what I mean. You're smart." Lu Chun shrugged and said, "But we still haven't caught that old turtle." Old Ma smiled optimistically and said, "That's fine. I didn't have much hope for it at first. However, ever since I heard that Elder Ghost refused to leave Immortal City, it's only a matter of time." Lu Chun nodded and did not object. In the past, they couldn't do anything to these evil sect spies and ghost elders who were hiding in the Immortal City. That was because they were hiding too deep and their whereabouts were unpredictable. Even the experienced Fiyunji couldn't catch them. But now, firstly, there was Chun-He, the traitor who almost knew countless of the evil sect's secrets. And secondly, they knew that Elder Ghost could not leave the Immortal City for some unknown reason. So the situation was completely different. He did not even urge Chun-He, because the current situation was that Fiyunji was gradually tightening the encirclement, pulling out the evil faction's hidden nails one by one, An elder ghost, this old tortoise's hiding place and leeway, would eventually become smaller and smaller, until there was no way to escape. For thousands of years, this was probably the most embarrassing and most critical moment for the evil cult. Life and death, there was only a thin line. Old Ma glanced at Lu Chun from the side. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Not long ago, this man seemed to have secretly discussed with him whether to secretly leave this immortal city and then wander the world to live a carefree life. All right, that was a nice way to put it. It was more likely to be to drag out an ignoble existence. But now, the situation was completely different. He'd ascended to the heavens in a single step, and shockingly, he'd become a powerful and influential figure in the true Immortal Alliance. Everyone raised their eyebrows, and his name shook the world in a single day. His future was bright, and the changes in his circumstances were so great that it truly caused others to feel as if they were dreaming. Looking at his current high-spirited look, who could still think of the loneliness when he was frustrated in the past? Feeling good, right? Old Ma couldn't help but still asked Lu Chun. Lu Chun, on the other hand, didn't understand and said, "What?" Old Ma asked, becoming the true monarch's successor, now holding great power. "Is this life comfortable? Is your mood good?" Lu Chun laughed and said, "It's okay, a little better than a few days ago." "Nonsense." Old Ma scolded with a smile. But in his heart, he was also happy for him. It was just that in addition to the joy, there was also a faint sense of loss in the depths of his heart. For so many years, Lu Chun had practically always been together with him. They had gone through tough times, seen blades and swords, and walked through the gates of hell. But in the end, the fate of the two of them was as different as heaven and earth. Why was this? Were people always different from each other? But where was the source of this unfairness? He thought indifferently, then said goodbye to Lu Chun, turned around and left. Lu Chun's identity and status were now different from before that incomparably noble Kunlun Palace. Except for the supreme, true monarch Tianlan, he now had the qualifications to live in that incomparably noble Kunlun Palace. But Old Ma didn't have that qualification. He was just a person who had lurked in the Jianghu for many years, accompanying by Lu Chun's side as a messenger. So in the end, he could only live outside. For so many years, if Lu Chun was the shadow, then what was Old Ma? Old Ma thought, "I'm probably the shadow of a shadow, more indifferent than the shadow, and less sense of existence than the shadow. The shadow might have the opportunity to leave a black shadow on a sunny day, but from beginning to end, he was only silent. For a person like him, even if he was killed in a legend, it would only be a few strokes of the brush, like a ripple on the surface of the water. There would be almost no movement, not to mention the stormy waves that would be set off by those big shots. Silent in life and silent in death. Is this the life you want? Is this the destiny you are destined to live? Old Ma stopped in his tracks and glanced back. The tall mountain peak was like a giant, silently looking down at him, perhaps with a bit of contempt. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, the majestic shadow shrouded everything and gradually disappeared into the darkness. Old Ma thought silently for a long time, finally sighed softly, turned around, and walked into the gradually falling night. Is there anyone in this world at this time who will still be dead set on following the devil sect, or even join the devil sect? Almost at the same time, in that room on Tianlong Mountain, White Lotus sat on the bed and asked Su Qingjun this question. Su Qingjun laughed in spite of herself and said, "Of course there won't be. Even if there is, it would be a madman or a fool." White Lotus shrugged her shoulders and did not say anything, but Su Qingjun suddenly made a sound of surprise and looked up and down at this young girl. White Lotus felt a little strange being looked at by her, said, "Everything is fine. Why are you suddenly looking at me like this?" Su Qingjun smiled and said, "Probably because you have been with Lu Chun for a long time, I feel that some of your actions are very similar to him." White Lotus was startled for a moment, then sneered and said, "Nonsense. How can I be like him?" Su Qingjun also felt that it was not possible, laughed, walked to White Lotus and sat down, stretched out her hand and gently stroked her soft hair. This action was intimate and gentle, White Lotus did not have any intention to resist or avoid. It seemed that during this period of time, the relationship between these two girls had become very close. After a while, Su Qing-jun softly asked, "Your injury is considered to be almost healed. Why are you still not willing to let me tell Luchun?" White Lotus suddenly felt nervous, looked at her, and said, "Don't tell me you have already told him?" Su Qing-jun shook her head and said, "Not yet, you little girl. 2 days ago you even threatened me, saying that if I say that your injury is healed, you will immediately stab yourself a few more times and make your injury worse. You have already said such words. How can I dare to say it?" White Lotus forced a smile, looking a little embarrassed, then sighed and said, "I really have something difficult to say. Can you help me hide it for a few more days?" Su Qing-jun nodded, then immediately frowned and said, "What are you afraid of? Don't tell me Luchun is really behind my back, threatening you in any way." Or White Lotus immediately shook her head and said, "Oh, that is not a—" Suddenly, White Lotus's words were abruptly cut off. The pair of eyes that had been calm and clean for a long time lit up a bit. She looked at Su Qing-jun's beautiful face, suddenly revealing a trace of a strange smile. Su Qing-jun was surprised and said, "What's wrong?" White Lotus was silent for a moment, then slightly smiled and said softly, "If I say Luchun really has bad intentions towards me, and even has the guts to do it, would you believe me?" "What?" Su Qing-jun lost her voice, her complexion changed, and suddenly stood up. Chapter 507. The room fell into silence. Su Qing-jun looked at White Lotus with a shocked expression. White Lotus looked at her with a smile at first, but then she felt that this expression was not quite right. Her face immediately darkened, revealing a bit of solemnity. After a while, she seemed to feel that she should be a little more sad, and her eyes became a little red. Then she sighed, seemingly helpless and sad. Looking at Su Qing-jun, she blinked her clear eyes. The atmosphere seemed to be a little awkward. Su Qing-jun stared at White Lotus for a while, suddenly opened her mouth and said, "Is what you said true?" White Lotus asked in reply, "Why, you don't believe me?" Su Qing-jun hesitated for a while, then nodded and said, "I really don't dare to believe it. I don't think Luchun is this kind of person." White Lotus sneered and said, "It sounds like you know him very well. Then tell me, what kind of person is he? Why don't you believe that he would do such a thing?" Su Qing-jun frowned and looked at White Lotus. After a moment of silence, she said, "I feel that your expression is also strange. According to what you said before, if Luchun really did harm your body, shouldn't you look sad and in pain now? Why do you still look as if nothing happened?" White Lotus paused for a moment, then sighed softly. Her face revealed a somewhat bitter smile. She used her hand to lightly press on her heart and said to Su Qing-jun, "How can I casually say these things to my face? Even if I do, I will hide it in my heart. It's only you who have such a good relationship with me these days. You can be considered as the first friend that I can confide in. That's why I can't help but tell you." Su Qing-jun ignored her explanation. She just frowned and said, "But you don't look sad. Even after you are injured these days, you look good and in a good mood." White Lotus slightly lowered her eyes, then gritted her teeth as if she had made up her mind and said, "Since it has come to this, I will tell you directly." "Huh?" Su Qing-jun was startled and said, "Is there anything else you haven't told me? I actually like him in my heart." White Lotus clenched her fist and said loudly, as if she was announcing to the whole world. Of course, in front of her, there was only Su Qing-jun in front of her. Su Qing-jun was obviously shocked again. It seemed that she suddenly completely did not recognize the girl in front of her. She stammered and said, What did you say?" "But, just now, didn't you complain to me that Luchun did bad things to you?" White Lotus snorted, and her elegant and pure face revealed a bit of sadness. She said, "Yes, that's the truth. But I quickly discovered that I actually really like him. Even if he did such a thing to me that was worse than a beast, I still like him. So, I am willing to be with him." She glanced at Su Qing-jun and said with a more and more certain tone, "Yes, when we didn't go up the mountain for a period of time, We lived together in the White Tiger District's Shima Bridge at the foot of the mountain. It was probably the first time that Su Qingjun had seen such a girl in her life. After hearing such words, the astonished expression on her face had not calmed even now. Perhaps the experience and etiquette that she had learned since she was young had been shattered by the girl in front of her in this instant. But Su Qingjun was after all not that kind of simple-minded woman with big breasts and no brains. After a while, her expression gradually calmed down. It seemed that she had already sensed something. She looked at White Lotus with even more suspicion and said, "That's not right. What you've said, I still feel that there are many parts that are unreliable." White Lotus looked at her with interest and said, "From what you've said, I think that in your heart, you probably believe in Lu Chun a bit more than you believe in me." Her smile suddenly flashed with a trace of hidden malice. She said softly, "Don't forget, back then, what did he do to you and to your family? He is not a good person." White Lotus continued to speak in a resolute tone to Su Qingjun. Su Qingjun was silent. After a while, she opened her mouth and said calmly, "You're right. Lu Chun shouldn't be counted as the kind of good person that we're talking about. But I still feel that he wouldn't do such a thing." White Lotus sneered and said, "You don't need to speak up for him. That person, Lu Chun, in the past, mingled in the outside world that you and I don't know. To put it bluntly, there are many things that you don't know about him. You don't understand him at all. When he went on a killing spree, could you have thought of it?" As she said that, she emphasized again, "And as I said, although he used force in the beginning, I later liked him willingly, so I got together with him." Su Qingjun just shook her head. Her eyes became clear and firm. She said lightly, "No, you're just a child. He can't possibly like you." White Lotus looked at Su Qingjun's expression and felt uncomfortable in her heart. She felt like her teeth were itching. After hearing this, White Lotus suddenly froze. After a while, she suddenly jumped up, like a kitten whose tail had been stepped on. She suddenly fell into a state of rage. She shouted angrily, "Nonsense! On what basis do you say that he won't like me?" Su Qingjun was also startled by White Lotus's sudden violent and shrill shout. She was stunned for a moment, then she frowned and said, "Don't shout randomly. Speak properly. Although Lu Chun has all kinds of shortcomings, I believe that he has enough self-control, even in the face of a soul-stirring beauty." Halfway through her words, Su Qingjun suddenly stopped. She didn't know why, but her cheeks blushed for no reason. She seemed to have thought of something, but she quickly returned to normal. However, there was still a hint of hidden bitterness in her expression. She sighed softly and said, "He won't have bad intentions towards a little girl like you. Why do you have to slander his reputation?" White Lotus slapped the table and stood up. She seemed to be very angry and said, "What do you mean by this? Are you saying that I'm not good enough and not qualified to seduce him?" Su Qingjun was stunned for a moment. She suddenly became speechless. After a moment, she said with a bitter smile, "I say, on this matter, aren't we getting further and further away from each other? Where are we going?" White Lotus was still unconvinced. She nimbly jumped off the bed and stood in front of Su Qingjun. She raised her head and puffed out her chest. She sternly said, "No way. I must make this matter clear to you. Look at my face." As she spoke, she used her finger to point at her cheeks, and then she touched her body and said, "Look at my figure again. This chest, this waist, these legs, this figure, aren't they better than 90% of the women in the world? What right do you have to say that I'm not good enough?" Su Qingjun looked at her for a long time. She suddenly laughed. Her expression became gentle. She stretched out her hand and gently hugged White Lotus. White Lotus struggled for a moment. She seemed to be unwilling, but in the end, she didn't leave. Su Qingjun said with some emotion, "Listen to me. You're at your best now. Your future is bound to be limitless. Why do you have to pour dirty water on yourself? This world is a lot more difficult than we think." If these words were accidentally spread, Lu Chun would naturally be a bit embarrassed, but he wouldn't necessarily lose all of his power. In fact, there might even be some people who would envy him. On the contrary, it's only us women. Those disgusting and vicious words will entangle you and follow you for a lifetime. There's no need, Su Qingjun said softly. Even if you hate Lu Chun, there's no need to do this. White Lotus was silent. She seemed to be moved by Su Qingjun's kind and gentle words. Perhaps this was the first time in many years that she felt a strange warmth. After a while, she said, "Well, to be honest, those words just now were not true." Su Qingjun breathed a sigh of relief and smiled sweetly. White Lotus said again, "I don't hate Lu Chun, but I want to tell you one thing. This person must have a lot of secrets. You might be able to guess that he didn't fool around with me. But what about before? How did he spend the past 10 years? Did he sleep with other women? Or did he sleep with more than one woman? Did he sleep with 5, 10, or even more women?" As she spoke, her face gradually looked cold. Even her voice became a little cold. "You're good to me, so I'll tell you the truth, even if these words are not pleasant to hear. Before you believe him, before you like him, think about these things first." With that, White Lotus lightly pushed Su Qingjun's hand away and turned to walk to the side. Su Qingjun was stunned at this moment. She stood there in a daze. Her face gradually became a little pale. Chapter 508. The affairs of the world were like a big dream. How many times did life experience the coolness of autumn? Unknowingly, the immortal city had once again arrived at the chilly autumn with falling leaves. Although during this period of time, Zhengxiaming and Fiyunji's men were busy pursuing and intercepting the evil sex forces in the immortal city to completely eliminate this malignant tumor from the immortal city, but for the vast majority of the immortal city residents, these things did not affect their lives, and there were even many people who knew nothing about it. People lived in their own world. As long as it was peaceful within their sight, they would think that everyone and the whole world was safe and sound. Therefore, most of us could live happily and with a clear conscience, simply and quietly, until something woke up the beautiful dream. That day, the weather was a little gloomy. The autumn wind that blew from the 4-river plain seemed a little harsh and chilly. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, but there was no sign of rain. In short, it was a gloomy day that looked no different from usual. Countless people in the immortal city were living their lives as usual. Everyone did what they were supposed to do. It was bustling and bustling as usual. Mount Sky Dragon stood tall and majestic. The huge statues of the 4 great divine beasts were still staring at this ancient and huge city as usual, until a strange phenomenon appeared in the sky. As if there was no warning at all, in the sky above the immortal city, in the gloomy sky, suddenly a strong red light suddenly appeared, and then from east to west, it stretched across the sky like a boundary line that divided the sky into 2 halves. Immediately after, dark red light shot out from that red light, covering the sky. But strangely, these light only spread towards one side of the red line, and the other half of the sky was completely unaffected. It was still that gloomy look. Not long after, the sky became half gloomy and half blood red. This was, of course, an unusually rare, strange phenomenon, and it happened right above the immortal city. Countless people in the huge city only needed to raise their heads, and they could easily see this scene. The blood-red light flickered and was reflected in the countless eyes that looked up. It was like a burning sea of blood. That strange aura made people subconsciously hold their breath, as if something terrible was about to happen. For that moment, inside and outside Immortal City, below and below Celestial Dragon Mountain, everyone fell into silence. Countless people looked at the sky above their heads, which seemed to have been torn in half. They were dumbfounded and didn't know what to do. However, this phenomenon did not last for too long. In less than 15 minutes, the red light in the sky dimmed. Soon, all the lights scattered until the red line that split the sky also disappeared. The sky returned to that gloomy and lifeless day, as if nothing had happened. However, inside and outside the Immortal City, countless discussions and whispers rang out in every corner of the Immortal City. On Mount Tianlong, in front of the Kunlun Temple, perfected Lord Tianlong and Lu Chun stood side by side at the entrance of the temple. Almost at the same time, when the phenomenon appeared in the sky, perfected Lord Tianlan, who was talking to Lu Chun in the temple, sensed something and walked out to look at the sky. Together with Lu Chun, he basically saw this rare and strange phenomenon in the sky from the beginning to the end. When the rainbow light in the sky completely dissipated and everything seemed to return to normal, the master and disciple in front of the Kunlun temple did not speak for a while. Lu Chun glanced at perfected Lord Tianlan. From the side, he suddenly realized that the usually calm, perfected Lord Tianlan actually had some inexplicable emotions on his face. It seemed to be happy and sad at the same time, and it was hard to tell which was rare. Perhaps sensing Lu Chun's gaze, perfected Lord Tianlan turned around and exchanged glances with Lu Chun. His expression returned to normal, but he smiled and said, "Have you seen this phenomenon before?" Lu Chun shook his head and said, "I've never seen him before." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Yes, it is indeed a rare phenomenon. But judging from your expression just now, you seem to have an opinion?" Lu Chun hesitated for a moment and then said honestly, "Yes, I think it's a little strange because the red light in the sky just now is somewhat similar to the blood moon in the underground maze of the devil cult. But it's hard to say. After all, the entire underground cave is covered by the blood moon, but the sky is divided into two halves. It looks very strange." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him again and then nodded. "You have a good eye. It is indeed similar to the blood moon in the underground palace of the devil cult. There should be some relationship that we don't know yet." Lu Chun was stunned for a moment, but at that moment, he heard something different in perfected Lord Tianlan's words. So after a moment of hesitation, he still asked tentatively, "You just said the underground palace of the devil cult, and not the maze of the devil cult?" "The underground palace of the devil cult," perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly. As for what exactly the devil cult was, why was the huge underground palace built, and what great secret was there, perfected Lord Tianlan did not explain in detail to Lu Chun. He just asked Lu Chun lightly, "How's the matter at the devil cult? Have you found Elder Gui's hiding place?" Lu Chun said, "All the hidden spies have basically been removed by us. The devil cult's years of hard work here are almost all gone. We haven't found Elder Gui's whereabouts yet, but after a thorough search, there are not many places where he can hide. At most 2 months, we will be able to catch this old tortoise." Perfected Lord Tianlan first smiled and nodded, saying, "Well done. That old tortoise is cunning and indeed troublesome." As he spoke, he pondered for a moment, then kept his smile and said to Lu Chun seriously, "But the situation is different recently. I can probably give you a month's time at most. Bring that person called Chunhee with you. The Fuyunji troops will be jointly commanded by you and Shuang. Do your best to catch this fiend." The corner of Lu Chun's mouth twitched, but he cleverly did not ask whether it was him or Shui Ying who was in charge of this matter. He only agreed. Then he looked at perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "Looks like this red light phenomenon is very important to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand and said, "I'll tell you later." With that, he smiled and walked into the hall with his hands behind his back. Lu Chun looked at his back and suddenly shouted, "Do you want to live or die?" Perfected Lord Tianlan did not even stop walking. Along the way, he only waved his hand casually and said, "Either is fine." With that, Lu Chun did not ask anymore. From a certain point of view, perfected Lord Tianlan's words gave him a lot of power. But when he turned back to look at the calm sky again, an inexplicable anxiety slowly appeared on his face. He raised his head and looked at the sky in a daze. But no matter how he looked, he could not see anything unusual, let alone the mysterious blood moon underground that he was thinking about. A great show seemed to be slowly unfolding. This was a sudden feeling in Lu Chun's heart. Chapter 509. At a certain time during the day, the originally quiet celestial dragon mountain, or more precisely, this area of Fuyunji's territory, suddenly erupted into a commotion. Orders were sent out from the Floating Clouds Division's main hall. They were quickly sent out in all directions by the nimble people. Then, in a short period of time, more people began to gather from different places, like a stone smashing into the water and creating ripples. At this moment, there were already many people in the main hall. Most of them stood quietly and solemnly at the side. At the center of the symbol of power, Shui Ying and Lu Chun stood side by side. Some distance away from them, Ma and Chun he also stood there waiting for orders. Different from the people around them who faintly revealed a bit of killing intent, Shui Ying and Lu Chen's faces looked relatively calm, as if they did not feel that what was about to happen was some earth-shattering event. At least, they looked much calmer than the others. Shui Ying's gaze swept across the main hall, intentionally or unintentionally looking at Chun-Yi's face. Then, without turning her head, she only lowered her voice and said in a voice that only Lu Chun beside her could hear, "Look, that Chun-Yi seems a little excited." Lu Chun glanced over there, his expression also unchanging. He said, "There's nothing strange about it. When he first came to our side, his biggest capital was to think that he could help us capture Elder Gui. In the end, after so long, the evil cult has caught many spies, but the biggest one has never been seen. It's only right that he is a little anxious." Shui Ying suddenly smiled and said, "Right now, the person who wants Elder Gui dead the most is probably him. Maybe right now, his mood is even more anxious than our Fiyunji." Lu Chen's gaze swept over there, and, as expected, he saw Chun-Yi standing there. Although at first, there did not seem to be anything wrong, after careful observation, one could see that he seemed to subconsciously clench his fists. His gaze was sharp, and he occasionally glanced outside the main hall, as if he was very anxious, hoping that the people gathered here would arrive as soon as possible so that they could do that important thing. Lu Chun retracted his gaze, shook his head slightly, and said nothing more. However, both Lu Chun and Shui Ying's attention had been placed on Chun-Yi earlier. Hence, they could tell that there was something strange about Chun-Yi's expression. However, the two of them did not notice that the person standing beside Chun-Yi had also turned his head around at this moment. Although his expression was the same, his eyes were a little strange as he looked at the two of them, who represented status and power in the crowd. Because they were too familiar with each other, people would always subconsciously ignore the people around them, always thinking that they would be the same as before and nothing would change. Perhaps it was because of the many experiences they had in the past, and perhaps it was because of the trust that came from the bottom of their hearts that they would not think too much. It is as if we always think that our friend will always be there for us, as if it is only natural that he or she should be there for all eternity. Even the greatest and most meticulous person would often be like this. Lu Chen's gaze shifted away. He saw that more and more people were entering the Great Hall. Other than Fiyunji's troops, the group of experts dispatched from the Kunlun party had also been called over. He quickly saw Su Qingjun in the crowd. Coincidentally, that woman was also looking in his direction. Lu Chun revealed a trace of a smile, nodded at Su Qingjun, and smiled. Unexpectedly, not only did Su Qingjun not smile back, she looked at him with a complicated expression. Her expression was cold, and after a moment, she turned her head away without any reaction, as if she did not see him. Lu Chun was startled. He thought, "Is she angry? But I did not provoke her recently. Or is it because something happened to Su Qingjun before, and she is unhappy?" Seeing that almost everyone had arrived, Shui Ying glanced at Lu Chun, a trace of inquiry in her eyes. Lu Chun smiled, took half a step back, and at the same time made a modest gesture. Shui Ying smiled slightly, and did not decline again. She took a step forward. This time, she immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the Great Hall. The few whispers that were originally there immediately quieted down. "Today we are going to do something big," Shui Ying said straightforwardly. Under the continuous pressure of Fiyunji and Zheng Xiaming, in the process of almost non-stop sweeping and exterminating the hidden spies of the evil cult, the people who stood in the light and absolute power could not understand the despair of those who were constantly being pressured, hearing from time to time that their companions around them had died, and having a dark and lifeless future. Despair made people feel pain, it made people crazy, and it also made people have no way out. Even if they once had the most unwavering determination, it was possible for them to collapse at the last moment. This kind of thing happened. Among the last remnants of the evil cult, there were finally people who could not endure it in their hearts and secretly sought refuge with Fiyunji. Then, like all the traitors in the world, they needed a presentable gift, a proof of allegiance. This proof of allegiance was quickly delivered to Shui Ying and Lu Chun. It was a piece of news. The traitor of the evil cult clearly pointed out that there was a very important, illustrious, but extremely mysterious high-ranking figure of the evil cult, who had been secretly arranged to hide in a secret place in a certain immortal city some time ago. And the reason why this traitor knew was because that place was the meaning of his existence. His mission was to protect this kind of important figure in the evil cult to temporarily take refuge. But now, this guardian of the refuge suddenly came to his senses and felt that he had taken the wrong path in the past and believed in the wrong person and the evil cult. Everything was the fault of the evil cult and that hateful elder ghost. Fuck the divine tree. Fuck the myths and legends of unifying the three realms. They were all lies. I want to live. He did not know the identity of this important figure. But what he knew was that only the true important figures of the evil cult were qualified to hide in his place. When Shui Ying's words echoed in the great hall of Fiyunji, everyone became excited. The identity of that deeply hidden important figure seemed to be on the verge of being revealed, and to completely destroy the last vitality of the evil cult, there was probably only one last step left. Shui Ying quickly began to make arrangements, and divided the hundreds of elite troops in the Great Hall into several batches, each with a leader. At the same time, the troops were made up of 10 people, and with an abnormally firm attitude, she explained that the 10 people in each team would supervise the operation together, and if anyone dared to leave the team alone or did anything to report to the outside, they would be immediately arrested and given the right to kill them on the spot. The meaning of this order was naturally clear to everyone. It was nothing more than an estimate that there were still some remnants of the evil cult that had infiltrated into Fiyunji, and in this capture, there was a high possibility that the important figure was Elder Ghost. No matter what, there could not be any accidents. The inescapable net, following the order, was opened. When the troops in the Great Hall filed out and flew down the mountain, Shui Ying and Lu Chun also walked in the same direction. At such an important moment, the two of them naturally had to be present. But as they walked, Lu Chun suddenly realized that Shui Ying's face did not seem to have much excitement, but instead looked a little disappointed. Of course, this was all hidden very well. If he was not standing next to her, he might not have noticed it. Lu Chun was about to open his mouth to ask, but then he thought of something and quickly suppressed this thought. He turned his head back to look at the tall and majestic Floating Clouds Division's main hall. This illustrious and prestigious palace towered high above Celestial Dragon Mountain. Sunlight shone on it, as if at this moment it had already reached its most glorious and dazzling moment. Chapter 510. When going down the mountain, Chun-Hee and the team looked a little nervous, seemed to be both excited and agitated, and also a little anxious. He found Lu Chun, pulled him aside, lowered his voice, and asked Lu Chun, "Will Supreme Tianlan come to today's arrest?" Lu Chun frowned, glanced at Chun-Hee. His expression was a little strange. Chun-Hee hurriedly shook his head and said, "Don't misunderstand. I have no other meaning. Since I have already decided to rely on a mortal alliance, I naturally know what to do." But he suddenly stopped, looked left and right, and then approached Lu Chun, said in a low voice, "But today's matter is really important. If that person is really Elder Gui, we must not make a mistake, otherwise it will be very difficult to find such a good opportunity next time." Lu Chun was silent for a moment, said, "You don't have confidence in Fiyunji's people?" Chun-Hee smiled bitterly and said, "Of course not. Fiyunji has been fighting with the evil cult for so many years, of course I know how powerful they are. But you also know, Elder Ghost is the last remaining master of the evil faction, and for many years he has always been mysterious and unfathomable. Even though I have been his messenger for many years, I have never been able to find out his background. For such a person, his cultivation realm, Dao's skills and supernatural powers are almost unpredictable. He paused again, said softly, "But if that Elder Gui has some secret means, or if he is secretly cultivated, his cultivation is extremely high, even reaching the level of deity stage, then it will be troublesome. Even if we can suppress him with so many people, we will either suffer heavy casualties or risk of him escaping if we are not careful. But if there is Supreme Tianlan in charge, the situation will be completely different." These words were reasonable, and Lu Chun couldn't refute them for a moment. However, he didn't immediately agree or answer Chen-He. Instead, after thinking for a moment, he said, "What you said does make some sense. However, my master is an elusive person, and his whereabouts are unfathomable. Although the various arrangements for today's matter were made by the Floating Clouds Agency, it is only natural that he is aware of it. However, I do not know whether he will come later or whether he will observe from the shadows." Chen-He was silent, probably understood something, then nodded to Lu Chun and walked forward. Lu Chun looked at his back, frowned slightly, after a while also continued to walk. To carry out such an important arrest, of course it was impossible to swagger through the streets with a large group of people and then arrogantly stroll to other people's door and knock. Even if you were strong and had an absolute advantage, this kind of behavior was not awe-inspiring, but would be called retarded. Before going down the mountain, this group of elite people dispersed silently, like water droplets converging into the vast ocean. In the blink of an eye, no trace could be found. However, under the calm sea, there were countless undercurrents that were closing in on the same target from all directions. Lu Chun and the other large groups separated. Walking on the streets of the Immortal City, he looked inconspicuous, like an ordinary person. Just as he walked near the long street where the explosion had happened before, a series of footsteps sounded behind him. He turned his head to take a look and found that it was Oldmar rushing over, walked to his side, and walked side by side with him. The two of them often walked in and out together, so they were not afraid of revealing their whereabouts. Lu Chun nodded to greet him, and Oldma also smiled. "Are you nervous? After all, that is the last big head." Oldma asked. Lu Chun thought for a moment, but smiled and said, "It's all right. You don't say. I have never thought about this before, but after you mentioned it, I found that I really don't feel excited. Probably because the evil faction is too weak, we don't really care about it anymore." Oldma was a little emotional, sighed a few times, and said, "How many years has it been? In the early years, I always felt that the evil faction was still a huge monster, the mortal enemy of our good faction. To defeat them was extremely difficult, and we don't know how much blood and lives had to be sacrificed, but in the end, today, it has become like this." Lu Chun lightly said, "Things are always done by people. If they did not do those things in the past, they would not have become like this so quickly." Oldma was silent for a moment, then smiled and nodded, and said, "You are right." The two of them walked through the long street, passing by the place that was blown to pieces, and there was only a big pit, and it was also tightly surrounded by many layers of cloth. Looking at the guards outside, Lu Chun and Oldma both took a few steps to the side and stayed away from that place. "Recently, I have been too busy to come here, and I thought that this place should have been filled up. Why is it still like this?" If it was only for a passage to enter and exit the underground maze, it was indeed only necessary to leave a passage. This long street was bustling, and it was indeed very inconvenient to enclose a piece of land like this for a long time. Standing beside Lu Chun, Oldma glanced over there, and then whispered, "I know this. I heard that not only did they not reduce the number of guards, but they also seem to have increased the number of people recently, and the defense seems to be impenetrable. Now, except for the Starry Temple's own people, almost no one from other halls can go to the underground maze." Lu Chun paused for a moment and said thoughtfully, "Speaking of which, it seems that after we left that place, we did not go down again." Oldma shrugged and said, "Isn't that so? But for what you said, it seems that there is no reason to go down there." Lu Chun smiled and did not answer. Oldma and him walked a few steps forward and suddenly coughed and asked Lu Chun, Oh yes, when I was going down the mountain just now, I saw Chun. He specially ran over to look for you and whispered to you for a long time. At this time, why did he look for you? Lu Chan did not think too much and said, "Oh, that's because he was a little worried and ran over to ask me about the whereabouts of the damn Baldy and whether he will go over today." Old Ma's expression suddenly changed, and Lu Chan glanced at him and said, "Don't worry, I just brushed it off," and did not say anything. Old Ma shook his head and said, "No, why did this guy suddenly ask about Sir's whereabouts? Could it be that he has other plans?" Lu Chun pondered for a moment and shook his head and said, "This should not be the case. Right now, among our group, the one who wants Elder Ghost dead the most is probably Chun-Hee. But he is worried that the old tortoise's cultivation is too high, and he is afraid that we will let him escape." Old Ma nodded and then said with some disdain, "He thinks too much." Lu Chan also smiled and turned his head. Seeing that they were unknowingly about to cross the long street, he suddenly thought of something, and suddenly raised his head to look at the sky above his head, and then turned back to look at the place that was tightly surrounded by cloth. Suddenly, Lu Chun was startled, and saw that above the ground that was surrounded by the cloth, there was suddenly an inconspicuous, auspicious cloud floating over, and then quietly landed, disappearing into the depths of the heavy cloth, and in a blink of an eye, disappeared without a trace. Who was that? Chapter 511. Unlike the scene of many Starry Hall's disciples bustling about in the underground maze a while ago, this huge underground city was still shrouded in a strange blood-red light, but almost no one could be seen as far as the eye could see. The people of Starry Hall who were working here had already evacuated, perhaps because of the omnipresent and elusive strange aura, or because they had already done what they should do. In the huge underground city, many tall buildings stood silently. They were empty, but they seemed to be quietly waiting for their owners to return at some point in time. A tall and burly figure appeared in this huge underground cave and walked into the long street of the underground city. When the light from the blood moon in the sky shone on his head, it would occasionally refract a strange halo. Starry Hall had already sealed this place and did not allow outsiders to enter or leave. Even most of the other halls in Xingxiaming were the same. However, perfected Lord Tianlan was an exception. Looking from afar, his wide sleeves fluttered as he walked, making him look like he was walking in a sea of blood. Every step he took seemed to leave a blood-red footprint on the ground. The empty city looked especially cold and murderous. However, as he gradually walked into this city that was bathed in the blood-red light, some strange and distorted runes gradually appeared in his line of sight. These runes were carved on the road, the corner of the wall, the door frame, the stone, and all sorts of corners. They seemed to be unrelated, but in fact, they were indistinctly independent. At a certain moment, after true Lord Tianlan's footsteps crossed an invisible boundary, suddenly, like a stone thrown into calm water, a series of ripples abruptly appeared around his body. The light and shadow in the air suddenly twisted and trembled, as if a wall of water was erected in front of him and swayed. It twisted into a strange mirror image in front of perfected Lord Tianlan, reflecting his shadow. It was as if another version of him had suddenly appeared in front of him, staring at him coldly. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression did not change as he looked at his other self indifferently before walking over. His body passed through the figure and continued forward without a sound. The figure actually turned around and looked at his back. Then it began to tremble and gradually dissipated into the air. The surroundings were silent, as if it had suddenly quietened down. Actually, after the Starry Hall disciples left, there was basically no sound in this underground cave. It was very quiet. However, when one was inside, there would more or less be some sounds, for example, the sound of unknown insects in certain corners, or the sound of wind drifting from the corner of a certain cave entrance. However, after crossing that invisible line, all the sounds in the city suddenly disappeared. It was a true silence that seemed to isolate all sounds outside of that invisible boundary. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked around and nodded slowly. There was a hint of satisfaction on his face. Then, he continued to walk forward until he reached the center of the underground city, next to the huge statue that connected the ground and the dome of the subterranean cavern. Perfected Lord Guyu of the Starry Hall was sitting here a few times before. The two of them would chat when they met. However, it was rare that even perfected Lord Guyu was not around this time. It could be considered as truly empty. Perfected Lord Tianlan pondered for a moment. His gaze fell on the spot where perfected Lord Guyu usually meditated. After a while, he walked over and stood there. Everything seemed to be the same. The only difference was that he was a little closer to the statue. After a while, when perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the sky, he soon realized that when he looked at the blood moon from this position, he seemed to be able to see a gap in the red light around the blood moon. In that gap, the blood moon seemed to be rotating slowly. In the past, there were no gaps around the blood moon at all. This place was clearly something that had appeared not long ago. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and did not seem to be too bothered. Then he walked to the side of the statue and reached out his thick and broad palm to press on it. It was ice cold. The statue did not move. But after a while, something seemed to throb behind the stone. Then, a terrifying aura suddenly rushed out from the depths of the statue. The aura was ferocious, and the numbers seemed to be unbelievably large. It was as if there were tens of thousands of evil spirits imprisoned in this huge statue. Then, at this moment, they suddenly felt the aura of the flesh and blood of a living person, and immediately surged out like raging waves. The statue remained motionless, as if all the movements had nothing to do with it. However, in the depths of the stone, a terrifying roar seemed to come from the depths of the netherworld. Wave after wave after wave, endlessly, crazily rushed towards perfected Lord Tianlan. Thud, 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 a strange and deep sound slowly rang out. It was originally extremely soft and almost inaudible to ordinary people. However, in the middle of this extremely quiet underground city, it was exceptionally clear and made one's hair stand on end. However, there was no fear on perfected Lord Tianlan's face. He even looked at the stone surface of the huge statue in front of him with a look of disdain. He slowly raised his hand and gradually left the stone surface. As if sensing that the warm aura of flesh and blood was gradually leaving, the strange voices behind the stone suddenly became agitated. All sorts of strange, mournful, and terrifying roars rose and fell, shouting at the top of their lungs. However, they were imprisoned by the stone, and all their desires were destined to turn into nothingness. The hand left the stone surface. Wong, like a string suddenly hitting a high note, all the noise suddenly disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place. The statue was still a statue, and the stone surface was still a stone. There was no change, and no strange things appeared again. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked down indifferently. His gaze landed on the place where the statue was deeply buried in the ground. A pondering expression appeared on his face as he raised his head to look at the blood moon above his head. In the end, he suddenly let out a soft sigh and muttered to himself, "It should be soon. There's only one last step left." Before he finished speaking, perfected Lord Tianlan's body suddenly paused, and he raised his eyebrows. He instantly turned around, and his eyes were cold and bright. An indescribable aura suddenly surged in all directions like a huge flood. At that moment, even the omnipresent blood-red light seemed to avoid this burly figure. Then, the surroundings became silent. There was no sound at all and no trace of anyone. However, perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes, which were as deep as the night, were rippling as he coldly swept his gaze across the surroundings. After a while, his gaze slowly stopped at a house near the city. As the light floated, it passed through the doors and windows, the courtyard, the empty corridors, the stone paths, the wasteland, and then a deep well that had long dried up. A dark shadow was hiding in the depths of the well. There was no warmth or aura from its body. It was like a natural stone that silently stayed in the darkness. Everything happened just now. When the terrifying and strange aura from the statue appeared and disappeared in an instant, his heart beat slightly faster. In the distance, perfected Lord Tianlan stared at the house and frowned. Chapter 512. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not deliberately lighten his footsteps, nor did he look nervous or cautious as if he was facing a great enemy. He merely walked towards the house as if he had sensed something. He walked calmly, naturally, calmly, and confidently, as if he was completely fearless, as if there was nothing in this world that was worthy of his scruples, even if he was in this desolate underground labyrinth, even if the scene of thousands of ghosts roaring had just happened not long ago. He looked as if he did not believe in heaven and earth, did not respect ghosts and gods, and despised fate. He only cared about himself and believed in his own strength. That was why he didn't even bother to lighten his footsteps or disguise himself. He just walked straight into the empty mansion with a wave of his wide robe sleeves. The house that was shrouded by the red light of the blood moon had a strange color. At first glance, it even looked as if the walls and house were slowly oozing blood. If a timid person were to come here, he would probably be scared to death. However, to perfected Lord Tianlan, these were, of course, meaningless illusions. There was not even the slightest ripple in his eyes as he calmly swept his gaze across the surroundings and observed the house. Under the red light, it was as silent as the outside. There was no sound at all. The extremely faint movement that had suddenly appeared at a certain moment earlier had naturally disappeared without a trace. In retrospect, that extremely faint movement that could not even be considered a sound was more likely just a momentary trance or a momentary illusion. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned as he stood at the entrance of the house, quietly looking at every corner of the house, as if he was lost in thought. At the same time, in the deserted backyard of the house, at the bottom of the dry well, where darkness shrouded, that black figure seemed to have completely turned into a lifeless stone, sitting motionlessly against the wall. There was no warmth, no breath, and no heartbeat. He did not even look like a dead person, but rather a stone that was as good as new. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood at the entrance for a long time, but still did not take any further action. It seemed that he was not sure what had happened just now, or perhaps he had only suddenly sensed a slight movement in the direction of the house. But after he came over, all the movements had disappeared. So, was it an illusion, or did it really exist? Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes shone brightly as he continued to scan the mansion. The invisible yet fearsome aura emanating from his body seemed to seep into every corner of the mansion. A moment later, he suddenly strode forward and walked into the house. In the dark well, the black shadow that had almost completely fallen into a deathly stillness raised its head slightly in the darkness. There seemed to be a strange light flickering in the darkness. He looked a little nervous. Pung pung. The footsteps were neither fast nor hurried as they steadily and forcefully stepped on the ground. Although there wasn't any great commotion, the figure in the darkness could clearly feel that some of the creatures living in the darkness in the depths of the soil beneath him, the little bugs and monsters that were far away from the surface and had never seen light their entire lives, were all fleeing in all directions, desperately trying to leave this place. A gust of wind suddenly blew past this place. There was almost no wind here. The figure in the darkness seemed to sense something and slowly raised his head. He looked up and vaguely saw a tall and burly figure suddenly appear near the mouth of the well. The light of the blood moon shone down from above, casting a black shadow on perfected Lord Tianlan's broad body and shrouding the mouth of the well. Perfected Lord Tianlan stopped in his tracks. This was the first time he had stopped walking from the front hall to the backyard. It was a desolate scene around him. Apart from himself, there seemed to be no other signs of life. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Everything seemed to be silent, empty, and lifeless. After a moment, perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze swept across all the corners of the place. Then he frowned slightly, and his gaze landed on the last corner, that dry well. The large group of people from Fuyunji split up and snuck into the ocean-like Immortal City. Then, 2 hours later, they quietly gathered from all directions and appeared outside a large mansion in the Vermilion Bird District of the Immortal City. Without a sound, they dispersed all the irrelevant people in the surroundings and suppressed all the abnormal noises and noises. It was said that in the past, there was a lame joke in the Immortal City. It was said that the name of Zhengxiameng Fuyunji could stop children from crying at night. This was used to make fun of the devil sect demons in the Immortal City for hiding like children. However, based on today's performance, even if the name of Fuyunji didn't make everyone fearful, it at least made most people revere them. Almost everyone cooperated and left. Thus, in silence, the people from Fuyunji surrounded this place. On the long street outside the mansion, Lu Chun and Old Ma stood side by side. Old Ma looked at the mansion that occupied a large area and sighed. These devil sect bastards seem to be quite rich. Then he said to Lu Chun in a low voice, I say, do you think the big guy hiding in this house today, could it be that old turtle? Lu Chun pondered for a moment, nodded, and said, I think there is at least a 70% chance that it is him. Some time ago, we wiped out many of the devil sect spies and informants. Almost all of their nests were wiped out by us. No matter how cunning and treacherous Elder Ghost is, the places he can hide in will definitely become less and less. Other than that, in the devil sect today, especially in the Immortal City, other than Elder Ghost, I really can't think of anyone else who could be considered as a big shot in the sect. Old Ma made a sound of acknowledgement and seemed to agree with Lu Chen's words. His face also revealed a look of anticipation. He clenched his fist and waved it and said, after getting rid of that old turtle, I want to see how those devil sect bastards can still stir up trouble. They will probably perish here. Lu Chen smiled and said, I hope so. As he spoke, he glanced at the house. In the depths of his eyes, a trace of complicated emotion flashed past. Even though it was a blood feud, even though they were irreconcilable enemies, even though the devil sect was so weak and Lu Chun had contributed a lot, not to mention that everyone wanted to kill each other as soon as possible. But Lu Chun had, after all, lived in the devil sect for many years. Seeing this sect that had been passed down for 1,000 years was about to reach its end, he also felt an inexplicable emotion in his heart. The once flourishing and flourishing, the heroes and heroism, all like the morning dew in a dream, disappeared in the past history, never to return. In front of them, there was a tall and charming figure. That was Shuang. After arranging everything, Shuang also seemed to feel that she had vaguely ushered in the highest peak of her life. That sense of accomplishment and satisfaction made her face exude an astonishing beauty. She raised her hand and waved heavily towards the house. Instantly, countless figures charged in from all directions while furious roars and shocked cries resounded. After a short moment, miserable and shrill cries pierced through the tranquility of the city, and they reverberated throughout the bright world, causing the clear sky to be covered in a layer of blood-red shadows. Lu Chen immediately turned his head to look at Shuang. Shuang sensed his gaze and frowned slightly. But after a moment of silence, she shook her head and said, I've investigated this family's background before, and there's no such thing. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then nodded without saying anything. But old Ma, who was standing beside him, hesitated for a moment, then took a step forward and said in a low voice, It could also be a private property that Supreme Tai who had secretly arranged, or an estate that belonged to someone else under his name. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mentioned only Supreme Tai Hu by name, and not the other Supreme Lords. He paused for a moment, then said softly, If we're not careful, I'm afraid that it might cause the two lords to be unhappy and fight. Lu Chen frowned. After a moment, he said in a deep voice, Once the bow is shot, there's no turning back. It's useless to say these things now. Olma nodded, said no more, and stood back. That was indeed the case. Currently, the big house was filled with the sounds of killing. Those who should be killed, many were killed, and those who should be killed, many died. How could they turn back? As for what would happen later, if Supreme Taihu were to be angry and punish them, they could only rely on Supreme Tianlan to bear the brunt. Fortunately, after so many years, perfected Lord Tianlan did not disappoint in these matters. When Lu Chun, Old Ma, and the others encountered difficulties and simply and crudely threw all the possible bad results to Supreme Tianlan, the person whom they had high hopes on, of course, could also be said to be the biggest scapegoat. The damned Baldy whom Lu Chun often talked about was standing in the underground city. In the blood-red light, he looked calm but somewhat solemn, staring at the dried-up well not far away in front of him. He had inspected almost every place in the mansion, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. Only this dry well in the wasteland of the backyard could be considered the last blind spot. If there were no suspicious points here, even Supreme Tianlan had to admit that he had probably sensed wrongly at that moment. There was no dangerous person here, as he suspected. At least for now, the mouth of the well was dry, cracked, and covered with dust. It seemed that it had not been used for many years, not to mention that there might be something hidden under it. However, perfected Lord Tianlan didn't intend to give up halfway. Although he wasn't sure if the outsider he suspected was hiding here, it wouldn't hurt to take a look at this place, since it was the only place left. Soon, he came to the edge of the mouth of the well. His tall figure covered the mouth of the well. Just when he was about to lean over to take a look, his body suddenly paused. Supreme Tianlan suddenly raised his head and looked back. An auspicious cloud flickered in the sky for a moment before dispersing. A moment later, the sound of footsteps could be heard. After a while, a silhouette appeared at the entrance of the house. The person hadn't arrived, but the sound had arrived first. "I say, what are you doing here alone?" Along with the laughter, Supreme Guyu of the Starry Hall appeared in his sight. He walked over with a smile, and at the same time, he clicked his tongue in admiration. He looked around the house a few times, and then said to Supreme Tianlan with a smile, "Could it be that you found some treasures buried by the demon clan? Let me tell you, if there's really such a good thing, you can't hide it from me. Everyone who sees it has a share." Perfected Lord Tianlan rolled his eyes, straightened his body at the entrance of the well, and turned around to face Perfected Guyu. "What treasure? Is there really such a thing? Your subordinates have almost turned this place upside down these days. What can't they find?" Perfected Lord Tianlan rolled his eyes. Supreme Guyu did not refute, and said with a smile, "Maybe their cultivation is too low and they can't find the hidden treasure." Perfected Lord Tianlan scoffed, and took 2 steps towards him with his hands clasped behind his back. "I was here a while ago. I felt that there was something strange in this house, as if someone was hiding here. That's why I came to take a look." Supreme Guyu was shocked and said, "There's actually such a thing? Did you find a person?" Supreme Tianlan shook his head and said no. After a pause, he frowned and said, "That voice was too weak and soft. Did I hear wrongly?" Guyu Perfected Monarch thought for a while, then pointed at the blood moon above her head and said, "Now that this place is constantly illuminated by the blood moon's radiance day and night, it greatly affects us cultivators. Perhaps you are also affected by the blood moon. That's why you made a mistake?" Supreme Tianlan hesitated for a while and then nodded slowly. He said, "What you said seems to make some sense." Supreme Guyu smiled and made an inviting gesture. The two of them walked out side by side. At the same time, Supreme Guyu said, "When I came here today, I saw your subordinates from Fuyunji gathering and going down the mountain. It seems like they're going to do something big." Supreme Tianlan looked at him and nodded. He said, "Yes, they told me that they're going to capture that Elder Guwei and bring him to me today." Chapter 514. Guyu True Lord laughed. His expression did not show much surprise. People who were in their positions, of course they were not people who were isolated from the news. There would always be all kinds of news transmitted to them through different channels. As to the degree of truth and falsehood, and how to make use of it, it was up to these bigwigs themselves to choose. So, Guyu True Monarch seemed to not particularly care about that extremely famous evil sect's last important leader, elder ghost. Speaking of this matter, although the evil sect was still notorious, intimidating, synonymous with the evil sects, the public enemy of the world's good faction, and also the number one enemy that Xingxiaming had erected, but in fact, in the eyes of those bigwigs in Xingxiaming, the evil sect was no longer in their eyes. Even if the evil sect still tossed around a few times and made some movements, but obviously everyone looked down on the evil sect more and more, no longer changing their expressions at the mention of the tiger in the past. However, when Guyu True Lord and True Lord Tianlan talked about this matter, of course, they did not intend to discuss the current situation of the evil sect. At most, he only smiled and said to True Lord Tianlan, "Evil sect elder ghost is after all the last elder-level figure. The depth of his cultivation is still unknown. Why don't you go and hold the fort for a while?" True Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "That old tortoise has been lurking in the immortal city for tens of years and did not dare to show his head, cowering all day long. What future can he have? I don't believe that a true lord who has cultivated to deity transformation realm would be so cowardly. Since that's the case, this person is not to be feared." Guyu True Lord nodded, seemed to agree with True Lord Tianlan's words. He sighed and said, "Indeed so, thinking back to the past, although the evil sect was ferocious at its peak, but in the sect there were indeed many outstanding geniuses. Who would have thought that today the descendants are really so unbearable?" True Lord Tianlan disdainfully smiled and said, "Now, in the evil sect, it's just incompetent people. But in the first 10 to 20 years, there were Yun Zhongyang and a few other old men who could look after it. It could be considered as barely maintaining the situation. Who do these people think they are?" Guyu Perfected Monarch laughed. "Speaking of this, weren't those old men still killed by you in the end? Back then, when I heard about this matter, I really sucked in a breath of cold air. The shadow you sent out was really amazing. He was so patient and tenacious, and his final strike was even more ruthless. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he changed the situation with a single sword strike." When he spoke up to hear, he shook his head and sighed. "At that time, I was thinking that if there really is such a person hiding by my side and not giving himself away for 10 years, then I'm afraid I won't be able to escape this sword from the back at the critical moment. Tao techniques, divine arts, and perfected monarchs are nothing in front of such a terrifying assassin." Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his brows slightly and smiled with a calm expression. "Brother Guyu, you must be joking. We're people who have cultivated to the soul formation realm, after all. How can we be so easily schemed against? Even if it's his trusted aide, it won't be easy for him to succeed." Perfected Lord Guyu laughed and then waved his hand. "Speaking of which, where did the two of us go? Haha, let's not talk about it anymore. All right, I actually came over to talk to you about another matter. It's related to the Elder Gui that your subordinates are chasing today. However, it has nothing to do with the fiend cult. It's that mansion." Perfected Lord Tianlan was slightly surprised. "What about that mansion? Is there a problem?" Perfected Lord Guyu hesitated for a moment. "I've also heard some news. After thinking about it, I'll tell you about it. Today, you guys want to surround that mansion. On the surface, it's obviously unrelated people. However, in reality, the owner might be the adopted daughter of Heavenly Law Hall's perfected Lord Tiehu, Song Wenji." Perfected Lord Tianlan was clearly startled. He didn't expect Perfected Lord Guyu to actually say this. And Perfected Lord Guyu saw Perfected Lord Tianlan's surprised expression. After a moment of silence, he also revealed a trace of a bitter smile. "You're quite surprised too, right? Not to mention you, when I first heard about this, I was also a little stunned. For so many years, old Tiehu has always thought of himself as a virtuous and virtuous person. Normally, he is also very strict with others and himself. Logically speaking, even if he dotes on this adopted daughter very much, he shouldn't have given her." Perfected Lord Guyu thought for a moment. Could it be that Song Wenji, this girl, is spoiled and arrogant? Relying on old Tiehu's reputation and power, she took everything for herself and bought this estate? That mansion occupied a rather large area, and was located in the prosperous area of the world's #1 immortal city. Its value couldn't be underestimated. An ordinary cultivator wouldn't be able to afford it. Moreover, Song Wenji herself was only a young lady in her early 20s. Then, where did this money come from? And why did she have to cover up the owner of the house? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at perfected Lord Guyu. After staring for a while, he suddenly laughed. You're not being honest. Why don't you dare to say it directly? Must you make me say it? Perfected Lord Guyu smiled. My star hall is small and weak. How can I afford to offend those righteous gentlemen from Heavenly Law Hall? Perfected Lord Tianlan spat. You already know that Heavenly Law Hall is in trouble. Why do you think I dare to offend them? Perfected Lord Guyu said seriously. You're a hooligan, stronger than him. Scram. Perfected Lord Tianlan glared at the cunning perfected Lord Guyu. After pondering for a moment, he said, As you said, this mansion probably has something to do with old Tiehu. As for whether there are still evil cult demons hiding inside, it's hard to say. Perfected Lord Guyu nodded. So after thinking about it, I still have to come and tell you. The situation over there is a little delicate. You should go and keep an eye on it. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a while before nodding in agreement. Then he frowned and said, If old Tiehu is really muddle-headed, I can't give in to him in front of so many subordinates. Perfected Lord Guyu shook her head. That old thing is very prideful. As long as you really catch the evil cult demons, I'm afraid he definitely won't come out. That's true. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly sneered. He seemed to have some disdain for the highly respected head of Heavenly Law Hall, Perfected Lord Tiehu. Then, he waved his sleeve and strode towards the door. When he passed by Perfected Lord Guyu suddenly called out to him and said, Oh right, that shadow from the Battle of the Desolate Valley. Is he still under you? Can you find a chance to let me meet him? Seeing Perfected Lord Tianlan's strange gaze, Perfected Lord Guyu smiled and said, This kind of talent, I've been fascinated by him for a long time. I really want to meet him and see what kind of outstanding person he is. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. Then, he shook his head and said, He was unlucky. During the Battle of the Desolate Valley, his injuries were too heavy and he has already died. Perfected Lord Guyu was startled. Then, he nodded and Perfected Lord Tianlan left. Perfected Lord Guyu looked at his back. His expression gradually turned cold. After a while, he seemed to have thought of something and sighed. He muttered to himself, Perfected Lord Guyu isn't afraid of a shadow sneak attack? Then how did your senior brother die back then? Chapter 515. Was there any secret collusion between the Tiehu Immortal of the Heavenly Law Hall and the Devil Cult? Most people in the world probably didn't believe it. To be honest, even Perfected Lord Tianlan himself didn't think it was possible. Although there was an old saying that one could not know a man's heart from his face, and Tianlan, who was also a deity transformation stage lord and had great influence in Zhengxiaming, actually knew some secrets about Tiehu Immortal that outsiders did not know. But even so, Lord Tianlan did not think that the old Tiehu would be so stupid, because it was not worth it and there was no need for it. Before the rise of Lord Tianlan, Tiehu Immortal could be regarded as a leading figure in Zhengxiaming. His fame, reputation, and strength were second to none. In addition, he had painstakingly maintained an upright image for many years and had always been respected by the righteous cultivators in the world. At that time, it was not an exaggeration to say that he was respected by the whole world. However, talented people emerged in every generation. After True Lord Tianlan, who was much younger than him, entered the union of true immortals, he changed his image of a deity realm true lord who had been calm and steady for many years. He was determined to forge ahead, worked hard, and especially grasped the devil cult, which was a big threat to the evil sects that everyone in the world was very afraid of. He launched an unusually high-profile and fierce war and became the leader of the pro-war faction in the Union of True Immortals, which was a huge organization and quickly expanded his strength. He also established Fuyunji, recruited masters, and acted fiercely. He was unscrupulous in promoting talents to the devil cult and catered to the wishes of a large number of young cultivators. He formed a sharp contrast with the other calm and prudent old immortals in Zhengxiameng. Because of this, his power grew rapidly, and the more he fought, the stronger he became. In the end, he suppressed the devil cult outside and subdued many halls inside, and became the new leader of the Zhengxiameng generation in one fell swoop. Such a talented and bold man attracted the admiration and respect of many young people. However, at the same time, he also attracted the disdain and dissatisfaction of the older generation. Among them, the discord between Immortal Tai Hu and Immortal Tianlan was a secret known by everyone in Sky Dragon Mountain. Of course, they were all bigwigs with high status, so they had to keep up appearances. For example, when Immortal Tiehu held a ceremony to accept Lu Chun as his disciple previously, Immortal Tiehu still came. However, even though the two of them were secretly at odds with each other, and the house at the foot of the mountain was rumored to be related to Immortal Tiehu, but when True Lord Tianlan saw the house that was embroiled in a fierce battle from afar, he still did not believe that Immortal Tiehu would really betray the good faction and collude with the evil cult. If the old man had such a thought, he would have discovered it long ago and used it as an excuse to put him to death. Indifferently and calmly, True Lord Tianlan thought about the various means of the other divine transformation stage True Lord. Suddenly, as if he had sensed something, he raised his head and glanced at the sky. The weather was fine today. There were clouds in the sky, but the clouds were a little thick. He stared at the thickest part of the clouds and frowned. The faces of Shuiying and Lu Chun did not look too good. In any case, offending a divine transformation stage True Lord, even if it was unintentional, was a heavy psychological burden for ordinary cultivators. For many years, the status of divine transformation stage True Lords in the vast cultivation world of the Divine Land had long been like that of a god, high above the masses and revered by tens of thousands of people. If at this time, the old divine transformation stage True Lord of Heaven's Law Hall suddenly arrived, flew into a rage, and even started a massacre, and the big backer behind Fuyunji did not arrive in time, then the situation would become very ugly and very dangerous. And the most troublesome thing was that everyone was in the Zhengxiameng system. There are almost no powerful means to restrict this kind of big shot. The most effective way was, of course, to have another divine transformation stage True Lord come forward to confront him. This was also the reason why, for many years in such a huge organization like Zhengxiameng, there were all kinds of mountain factions, but in the end, almost all of them belonged to the forces of a few divine transformation stage True Lords. Therefore, at this moment, what these two people were most concerned about was whether or not there were people from the evil cult in this house. If they caught the evil cult demon, then everything could be easily solved. The evidence was right there. Even Tai, who True Lord, could not say much, and instead had to spend effort to exonerate himself. It should be known that Fuyunji was not a small hall without a backer. Behind it stood the current number one person in Zhengxiameng, Tianlan True Lord. Shuiying had already passed down the order to tighten up the encirclement. No one must be allowed to escape. Killing people could be slow. The most important thing was to quickly confirm that the people resisting here were evil cult demons. But as the battle continued, the news that came out was not very optimistic. The resistance inside the house was very tenacious, and there were many experts hidden in this inconspicuous house. But what was more troublesome was that almost all of the people inside were of unknown origins. In other words, almost none of them had any marks or items related to the evil cult, and that so-called big shot, for the time being, had not been caught. Shuiying waited for a while, and suddenly called over a person beside her to ask a few questions. That person then quickly left and entered the house. After a while, he came back and directly walked to Shuiying's side to reply. Shuiying had no intention of hiding from Lu Chun, so that person did not lower his voice, so that Lu Chun and Old Ma beside him could hear his words. Actually, his reply was not complicated. He only told Shui that Shun he was still here, and that he was indeed with the main force, and was charging at the forefront. His attacks were ruthless and incomparably fierce, and he was even more hard-working than the people of Fuyunji. After that person finished speaking, he retreated. Shui turned back to look at Lu Chun, who was expressionless. Instead, it was old Ma who smiled, and with some intention of smoothing things over, said, "That's not bad. At least it seems that Chun he is not a problem. Let's see if we can catch that Elder Gue later. I don't think it will be a big problem." Shui frowned and said, "Let's talk about it after we catch him." As she said this, she turned back, looking a little impatient. Obviously, the sudden appearance of this matter that might involve true monarch Tiehu made her a little anxious. In comparison, Lu Chun was much calmer. At the same time, they heard the sounds of fighting in the house becoming louder and louder. It seemed that the battle had reached its most intense point, and the outcome was about to be decided. At this moment, suddenly, behind them, on the street that had been cleared by the people of Fuyunji, and on the street where all the unrelated people had been chased away, a figure suddenly appeared. Like a ghost, the figure appeared on the long street, and then walked towards them. The three of them turned their heads to look, and then their expressions changed slightly. The person who came was a young and beautiful woman with a charming appearance. It was true monarch Tiehu's adopted daughter, Song Wenji. There were already people chasing after them, and their expressions were stern, as if they were about to attack. However, Song Wenji did not even look at the people behind her, and only walked towards Lu Chen's group. Moreover, her gaze only seemed to casually sweep over Shui Ying and Old Ma, and finally stopped on Lu Chen's face. Seeing that the Fuyunji guards chasing behind them were about to catch Song Wenji, Shui Ying suddenly frowned, and then waved her hand. The guards were startled for a moment, and then immediately obeyed and retreated. For a moment, many people on the long street looked over. They saw Song Wenji calmly walk in front of the three people. To be exact, among the three of them, she seemed to only pay attention to Lu Chun. She stood in front of Lu Chun and then looked straight into Lu Chen's eyes. Her gaze seemed to be exceptionally clear and bright, and there wasn't any obvious hostility within it, causing Lu Chun to be unable to determine the reason for her arrival from her gaze and expression. He could only smile and say, "Miss Song, may I know why you've come here?" Song Wenji was silent for a moment, and then opened her mouth to say to Lu Chun, "This house is mine." Lu Chun coughed and said, "Then I'm sorry. We heard that there is an important figure of the devil cult hiding here, so—" Song Wenji suddenly interrupted him and said, "You can do whatever you want, I don't care. It's just that in this house, there's a place where my deceased sister's memorial tablet is placed." Wenji sincerely asked senior brother Lu, "Do not disturb the peace of the deceased." After saying this, her eyes drooped, and her face showed some sorrow, but she sincerely bowed to Lu Chun. Lu Chun was immediately startled. Chapter 516. After standing in silence for a moment, Lu Chun did not directly reply to Song Wenji. Instead, he turned back to look at Shui Ying and Old Ma. The two of them had subtle expressions on their faces. Old Ma frowned while Shui Ying shook her head slightly. She looked a little unhappy. Lu Chun pondered for a moment, then reached out to help Song Wenji up. At this moment, he was so close to her that he could feel Song Wenji's extraordinary charm and beauty. Even someone as determined as him could not help but feel his heart tremble. Perhaps this was the so-called beauty of the world. The closer one was to her, the more they could not help but be attracted. Such a thought flashed across Lu Chen's mind, but he immediately suppressed those strange thoughts in his mind. His eyes became clear in the blink of an eye. He took half a step back and said in a low voice, "Miss Song, you said this house is yours? Then do you know what is happening inside?" Song Wenji's eyes fluttered as she glanced at the house. At this moment, there were all kinds of sounds of fighting and screams coming from inside. Even though she was blocked by the high walls, she could still feel the intense battle going on inside the house. Presumably, it was a scene of blood splattering everywhere. Song Wenji's expression changed slightly, as if she was hesitant. But in the end, she still said to Lu Chun, "This matter can't be hidden in the end, so I might as well tell you now. As for you people from Fuyunji," her voice paused, as if she did not know what to say for a moment. Lu Chun sighed in his heart. After staring at this charming woman for a moment, he said, "We received a secret report saying that the remnants of the evil sect, Elder Gui and the others, may be hiding in this house." Shui Ing and Old Ma stood to the side, their gazes also fixed on this woman, waiting to see what kind of reaction she would have after hearing these words. After hearing Lu Chen's words, Song Wenji's gaze dropped, her eyes drifting. It was unknown whether she was looking at the ground in front of her or at Lu Chen's legs. However, the expression on her face did not seem to change, as if what Lu Chen had said just now had no effect on her. After a while, Song Wenji said calmly, "Senior Lu, I really do not know about this. I did ask someone to buy this house back then, but because it was a little inconvenient, I hit a corner in the middle. Of course, if you really want to investigate, these things can't be hidden from you, so I don't have anything to hide. But I really have nothing to do with the evil sect. I don't usually live here. I only arranged people to clean it from time to time. If there really are evil sect people inside, then there must be something wrong with the people guarding here." After hearing these words, Shui Ing and the others frowned. Shui Ing and Chun did not have any intention to speak. However, both Shui and Lu Chun did not say anything, and looked at Ing looked. Old Ma was a little helpless, but he could only cough and then said to Song Wenji, "Well, Miss Song, it's like this. Although you just explained it to me, this matter is of great importance, and it's really not good to just let it go." "In your explanation," said Song Wenji. "To be honest, it's not easy to explain." Song Wenji's bright eyes flashed. She looked at Old Ma and said, "But what I said is the truth." Old Ma hesitated for a moment, then finally clenched his teeth and said, Chun, I have to ask you something. Please answer me truthfully." Song Wenji saw that he was serious and also became serious. "Please speak. You bought this house, but the money was paid for by your foster father? Was it Taihu Supreme who asked you to buy this house?" Song Wenji's expression suddenly changed. A hint of coldness appeared on her face. She did not answer immediately, but stared coldly at Old Ma. Old Ma's expression was the same as usual, as if he did not feel anything strange. However, he could faintly feel a trace of bitterness at the corner of his mouth. The atmosphere suddenly became somewhat stiff. For a moment, no one spoke. After a while, Song Wenji coldly said, "What do you mean by asking this question?" Old Ma smiled awkwardly and said, "This is something that must be asked. After all, you are Taihu Supreme's foster daughter. We have to clarify the relationship between you and him in this matter." Saying this, he couldn't help but add, "No other intention." No other intention would be absurd. The four people present all understood in their hearts that this question was so obvious. The meaning was obvious without asking. However, even though Song Wenji looked incomparably angry, she did not have the intention to act impulsively. She only silently stood there, coldly watching. Finally, she slowly said, "This matter has nothing to do with foster father." Probably this answer was exactly the same as what everyone had guessed she would say. That was why no one revealed any strange expressions. Instead, Lu Chun at this moment suddenly raised his eyebrows. His gaze passed over Song Wenji's shoulder and looked at the distant street. Suddenly, a tall and sturdy figure appeared. That shiny bald head waved at him from afar. After a moment, that person walked into a house by the roadside. Lu Chun hesitated for a moment and then said to Song Wenji, "Miss Song, you don't have to be anxious. We, Fuyunji, are here to capture the evil faction evil people. We will not purposely disturb your sister's memorial tablet, but this matter is of great importance. You are after all the owner of the house. Why don't you wait here for a moment?" As he spoke, he did not wait for Song Wenji's reply. It was as if he was certain that she would definitely stay here. He turned to Shuiying and said, "Hall Master, I will have to trouble you to accompany Miss Song for a moment. Once the fighting inside is over, we will go in and see if there are any evil faction evil people. The result will be clear at a glance. We will decide how to deal with them at that time." After speaking, he turned to Old Ma and said, "You also wait here. I will be back soon." After speaking, he smiled at Song Wenji and walked straight into the distant street. Shuang frowned, as if somewhat puzzled. She wanted to say something, but stopped. Song Wenji's expression changed. The three of them watched as Lu Chun walked into the distance. Then, for no reason, he turned a corner and walked directly into a house by the side of the street. Old Ma was startled and said, "What is he doing there?" Shui Ying and Song Wenji did not speak. After a moment, the two women looked at each other and then turned to look at the house together, listening to the sounds of fighting that had already begun to die down. In the distance, Lu Chun pushed open the unlatched door and walked in. He closed the door behind him. The light in the house was somewhat dim. However, two figures could be seen standing in the house. One of them on the left was tall and burly with a shiny skull. Lu Chun glanced at him, then walked forward and bowed, saying, "Master." This person was naturally perfected Lord Tianlan. He smiled and nodded slightly as a form of greeting. Then, Lu Chun turned to look at the other side. He saw the old man with white hair and beard standing there calmly. He hesitated for a moment and looked at true Lord Tianlan again. Seeing that there was no strange expression on this damn bald man's face, Lu Chun secretly cursed in his heart. Then, with a respectful smile on his face, he went forward and bowed to the old man, saying, "Disciple Lu Chun pays respect to true Lord Tiehu." Chapter 517. The sounds of fighting in the house finally calmed down. Although there were still a few screams and curses from time to time, they quickly stopped. It was unknown whether they were knocked unconscious or killed by blades and blood. On the long street outside the gate, the three people without Lu Chun became very quiet. No one spoke, and the atmosphere was very stiff. However, after hearing the sounds gradually disappear, Shuang finally snorted and said, "Let's go in." After saying that, she was about to walk into the house. At this moment, Old Ma suddenly coughed and said, "Lu Chun has returned." Shuang and Song Wenji's footsteps paused and looked back. They saw that Lu Chun was indeed walking over from the distance. His figure was calm, and his expression was calm. There seemed to be nothing strange about him. However, his eyes seemed to be faintly flickering, seemingly revealing some subtlety and strangeness. Shuang frowned and was about to speak when she suddenly sensed something. She glanced to the side from the corner of her eyes and saw that although Song Wenji's expression was the same as usual, there seemed to be a faint feeling of relief. Shui Ying's expression changed and suddenly became somewhat cold. After a while, Lu Chun walked in front of them and swept his gaze across their faces. In the end, his gaze lingered on Song Wenji's charming and moving face for a little longer. He then said calmly, "This house was bought 2 years ago, right? The person who bought it was called Lu Hu." Song Wenji saw that Lu Chun seemed to be unable to say that name and hurriedly answered. Lu Chun glanced at her and smiled bitterly. He nodded and said, "Yes, he's called Lu Hu, right? This person colluded with the devil cult, and his crime is unforgivable. He should have been caught in this house by now. Let's go in and take a look. When the time comes, we definitely can't let this person go." When these words were spoken, the expressions on the faces of the people present immediately changed, each with their own interesting expressions. Song Wenji let out a long sigh and smiled sweetly, as beautiful as a spring flower. Old Ma was dumbstruck, his face full of astonishment, and he looked as if he could not believe his own ears, while Shui Ying's reaction was the biggest. She was first surprised, then angry. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but then she snorted coldly, turned around, and walked away with a cold face. Lu Chun hurriedly took a few steps forward and rushed to Shui Ying's side. He whispered a few words to her, but Shui Ying did not seem to be satisfied. She did not even soften her voice. Instead, she angrily said, "Do you know how much risk we have taken? In the end, you let us go just like that?" With that, she strode forward again. Lu Chun frowned and grabbed her wrist. Shui Ying suddenly turned around, but before she could get angry, Lu Chun had already pulled her to the side and then quickly whispered to her in an extremely low voice. Whether it was Song Wonji or Old Ma, they could not clearly hear what Lu Chan was saying at that moment. However, they could all see that the expression on Shui Ying's face was constantly changing, from anger and excitement at the beginning to loss and loss at the end. After a while, Lu Chan finished speaking and then gently let go of Shui Ying's wrist. With a slightly apologetic tone, he said, "In a moment of desperation, I have offended Hall Leader Shui. I'm sorry." Shui Ying rubbed her wrist, but she did not seem to mind. She only closed her eyes slightly and revealed a bitter smile on her face. Then, she said in a low voice, "We have fought so hard up front." Inside, she pointed in the direction of the large house to Lu Chun and then said softly, "We do not know how many brothers in that house have been injured and lost their lives. But even so, is it still not comparable to a few casual words from the higher-ups?" Lu Chun was silent for a while, a sharp light flashing in the depths of his eyes. Then he said calmly, "Hall Leader Shui, you have been in this position for much longer than I have, and have seen far more of the world than I have. I believe this is not the first time you have seen something like this." He smiled and said, "Why make things difficult for me? I'm only a small lackey to pass on the message." Shui Ying glanced at him. Her eyes seemed to have a profound meaning, but after a while, all the expressions on her face disappeared. The anger, excitement, loss, bitterness, and unwillingness seemed to have suddenly disappeared. In the blink of an eye, she seemed to have become that high and mighty woman who held great power. She nodded at Lu Chun and said, "I will naturally listen to the Lord True Monarch's orders." After saying this, she walked into the house that had already quieted down, but the smell of blood had begun to waft out. Lu Chun stood in the same place for a while, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw Old Ma and Song Wenji standing behind him. Lu Chun nodded at Old Ma and said, "Let's also go in and take a look." Old Ma agreed, and the two of them walked toward the house. However, they had only taken 2 steps when Lu Chun suddenly stopped and looked back with some confusion. He saw that Song Wenji was actually still behind him. "Why are you still following us?" Lu Chun said to her, "Did I say it very clearly just now? Us catching Lu, who has nothing to do with you." Song Wenji nodded and said softly, "Yes, I understand. Thank you, Senior Brother Lu. Wenji is very grateful." Lu Chun sighed and said, "You don't need to thank me. I can't accept it. What I mean is, since you have nothing to do here, you don't need to go in. Otherwise, if other people saw you, wouldn't it be troublesome?" Song Wenji hesitated for a moment and said, "I understand that Senior Brother Lu is good to me. In fact, I have no intention of deliberately making things difficult for you. I just want to go in and take back my sister's memorial tablet and ashes. I don't want her to be disturbed after her death." She looked deeply at Lu Chun, and with a pleading expression, she bowed and said, "Wenji knows that this is an inappropriate request. I only hope that Senior Brother Lu can help me. After all, my sister used to be my only relative. She raised me with her own hands. I owe her a favor that I can't repay in this lifetime." Lu Chun was speechless for a moment. He looked back at Old Ma, but unexpectedly, Old Ma turned his head away and looked elsewhere as if nothing had happened. It was clear that he didn't want to get involved in this matter. Lu Chun smiled bitterly and looked at Song Wenji again. He saw that this woman was looking at him with an earnest face. Her eyes were as clear as a child's, and seemed to be shining with the light of desire and expectation. Was that the remnant light of her initial innocence? Was that the last bit of warmth in her memory? For some reason, Lu Chun couldn't bring himself to say the words that he should have refused. It was probably because he was thinking of the woman from many, many years ago, when his heart was still as hard as stone, and the woman whose face was already blurred in his memory. Finally, he nodded and said softly, "All right, you come with me. After you find your sister's things, take them and leave quickly. Otherwise, if there are any accidents, I'm afraid you will also be in trouble." Song Wenji suddenly smiled. She looked very happy, gratified, and happy. Her smile seemed to be as innocent as Lu Chen's, and there was no other meaning in his words. Chapter 518. Walking through the gate, they could feel the smell of blood thickening. There were no signs of a fierce fight in the front yard, but the further they walked, all kinds of bloodstains, collapsed doors and windows, broken stones, and even some bloodied corpses began to appear in their line of sight. It was obvious that this group of elites sent by Fiyunji did not have the slightest hesitation or mercy after receiving the order. Shuang was already walking in front, while Lu Chun and Old Ma walked behind with Song Wenji. In the middle, Lu Chun glanced at Song Wenji's expression from the corner of his eye, but found that this young and charming woman's expression was the same as usual, as if she was not affected by the surrounding scene at all. Perhaps because they had been together for more than 10 years, they had developed a tacit understanding. At this time, Old Ma turned to Song Wenji and said with a smile, "Miss Song, do you know these dead people next to you?" Song Wenji's expression did not change, and she did not hesitate to think. Very calmly, she said, "I don't know. When I was introduced to Lu Hu, I felt that he could do things, so I'll let him take care of this place. I don't know anyone here. They were all recruited by Lu Hu. The only connection I have with this place is that my sister's memorial tablet is still here." Old Ma and Lu Chun looked at each other, nodded, and did not say anything. In fact, there was nothing to say. She had already pushed the blame so cleanly in one breath. What else could they pursue? If it was a normal day, they would naturally have many ways to pursue the matter, but at this moment, this beautiful woman had an even bigger backer behind her, so whatever she said, it was up to her. After walking for a while, Song Wenji opened her mouth and pointed in a direction, saying that her sister's memorial tablet was placed in a quiet room on the other side. Lu Chun then let Old Ma lead him there. Unexpectedly, Old Ma was unwilling, only saying that there were many things ahead, and his identity was different from Lu Chen's. Lu Chun could walk freely, but if Old Ma slipped away halfway and was caught by some big shot in Fiyunji, he might suffer a lot. Lu Chun also felt a little helpless. Although he knew that Old Ma's words were mostly evasive, he could not say that what he said was unreasonable, so he could only wave his hand and let him go. Song Wenji still needed someone to follow her. Although Lu Chun didn't know what Immortal Tiehu had said to the damn Baldy, or what kind of deal they had reached to make Immortal Tianlan let them off, he didn't dare to let Song Wenji act alone in this house, as the matter was a little delicate. However, in the following time, it seemed that Lu Chen's worry was unnecessary. Song Wenji could not be more normal. From the beginning to the end, she was very obedient, walking with Lu Chun, never leaving Lu Chen's sight, and did not make any suspicious movements. They walked all the way to the quiet room she mentioned, and then, under the gaze of Lu Chun, went in and took out a small urn and the wooden tablet of the memorial tablet. Lu Chun glanced at the wooden tablet and looked at the row of words on it with a calm expression. Then, he looked away and said calmly, "Have you got them?" Song Wenji nodded and said, "These are the two things." "Thank you, Senior Brother Lu. Wenji is very grateful." Lu Chun smiled and said, "You're welcome. Since you've got the things, it's not suitable for you to stay here for long in this bloody place, so you should leave first." Song Wenji replied with an carried the small urn and the tablet, and walked out. Lu Chun followed behind her. He had only walked a few steps when he suddenly saw a figure turning the corner in front of him. The figure was tall and slender, and the two of them immediately met. It was actually Su Qingjun. Su Qingjun also did not expect to meet the two of them here. Looking at Lu Chun and Song Wenji, and then her eyes also saw the few things in Song Wenji's arms, she could not help but was startled, and her face revealed a strange expression. Song Wenji's expression right now was calm, and seemed to have some sorrow. Seeing Su Qingjun, she did not have any change, only nodded to her and walked over. Lu Chun for a moment felt a headache, but the matter was right in front of him. After thinking about it, he still had to follow. When he passed by Su Qingjun, he softly said, "There are evil faction heretics here. Be careful." Su Qingjun snorted, with some unhappiness on her face, lightly said, "When I was fighting with the evil faction heretics, I did not see you, so you came here." Lu Chun smiled bitterly, wanted to explain, but in the end he shook his head and walked over. And just like that, sent Song Wenji out of the house. After Song Wenji went out, she purposely stopped, turned, and smiled at Lu Chun, and then said, "This time I really have to thank Lu's senior brother for your help." Lu Chun said, "Don't mention it. Our relationship as elders is there. It is what I should do." Relationship, Song Wenji muttered, suddenly laughed, but she quickly calmed down, bowed to Lu Chun, and turned to leave. But after a few steps, she suddenly turned back and said to Lu Chun, "If you need me to explain to that Sister Sue, Lu Chun's senior brother, feel free to tell me." Lu Chun rolled his eyes, sternly said, "There is no such thing. I walk straight and sit upright. An upright body is not afraid of crooked shadows. There is nothing to explain." After a pause, he added, "Oh, that Su Qing-jun and I actually do not have any special relationship. Don't think too much, so as not to hurt her reputation." Song Wenji smiled. She didn't say anything and just floated away. Lu Chun looked at her back for a while, then turned around and walked back into the house. When he passed by the intersection, he purposely looked at the place where they had met, only to see that it was empty. There was no one there. At this time, there were basically no sounds of fighting in the house, but all kinds of noises and shouts were much more than before, rising and falling, gathering in the backyard of the house, occasionally accompanied by a few screams, but they quickly disappeared. Lu Chun quickened his pace and walked towards the backyard. The stench of blood in the air was getting thicker and thicker, and along the way, there were corpses strewn all over the place. Just as he was about to see the gate to the backyard, he suddenly heard a loud noise in front of him, as if many people were exclaiming in unison, and then excited voices could be heard. "Here, here! There's a secret door. Quickly open it. No hurry. Be careful of the traps. Surround the surroundings first. Where's the trap master? Quickly come and take a look. Hurry, hurry, it's open, it's open." "Huh? Eh." Suddenly, a scream came from that direction. The voice was mournful, followed by a loud shout. "Be careful. There is someone inside. Someone is hiding inside. Is it a big fish? It is not a big fish. Maybe it is a big turtle." Finally, someone suddenly said, and the backyard suddenly became silent. After a moment, suddenly there was a burst of laughter with endless joy, gratification, and excitement. Chapter 519. Even though they were far away, the cheers from the mansion could be faintly heard from the end of the long street. Ordinary people could not hear it clearly, but for divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, as long as they paid attention, they would naturally know what was going on. In the dim room, perfected Lord Tianlan and perfected Lord Tiehu had already sat down. When there were no outsiders present, the two of them seemed to be much more casual. They did not really care whether they were sitting on an ordinary wooden chair or a throne or a lotus seat in one of the lofty palaces on Sky Dragon Mountain. However, the room was still very quiet. Neither of them spoke, and it was precisely because of this that the burst of cheers sounded a little clearer. After a while, perfected Lord Tiehu suddenly broke the silence and said, "Do you think that the person we caught is Elder Ghost?" Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a while, then shook his head and said, "Probably not. If that guy was caught so easily, he wouldn't have been able to hide from us for decades in the Immortal City." Perfected Lord Tiehu nodded slowly, seemingly agreeing with perfected Lord Tianlan's words. After a while, there was a sudden sound of footsteps outside the room. The two important figures in the room did not seem to have any reaction. After a while, the footsteps stopped outside the door, and then someone knocked lightly on the unlatched door 3 times. "Come in," perfected Lord Tiehu said. The wooden door was pushed open with a creak, and Song Wenji walked in. She first called perfected Lord Tiehu Godfather, then turned her head and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan. Even though he was just sitting, perfected Lord Tianlan's tall and sturdy figure was still very astonishing. At first glance, he seemed to be slightly taller than the petite Song Wenji. At the same time, this bald perfected lord had an extremely imposing manner. He was not angry, but his eyes were as deep as the sea and seemed to contain wind and thunder. He really was like a god. Song Wenji did not know if she was intimidated by the imposing manner of the #1 person in Zhengxianming, but there was a strange expression on her face. She seemed to be afraid, but at the same time, she seemed to be worshipping and admiring him. Perhaps this was the common emotion that every ordinary person had when facing the gods and Buddhas. Even the practitioners with cultivation were no exception. She respectfully bowed to perfected Lord Tianlan and said softly, "Disciple Wenji pays respect to perfected Lord Tianlan." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was calm. His gaze lingered on the charming woman for a moment before he nodded. "Get up." "Yes." Song Wenji stood up and silently walked to the side of Supreme Tiehu. She stood a step behind him. After a while, she could not help but lift her eyes and look at Supreme Tianlan, who was not far away. When Song Wenji walked in, she was still holding her deceased sister's ashes and memorial tablet. However, both Supreme Tiehu and Supreme Tianlan did not care about this. Only Supreme Tiehu asked her lightly, "How is it in the house? Did anyone make things difficult for you?" Song Wenji replied, "Many people died. They are trying to catch the demons of the devil's sect. Senior brother Liu Chun treated me very well. He followed Lord True Monarch Tianlan's instructions and protected me. He even agreed to some of my unreasonable requests and even personally escorted me out." True Monarch Tiao nodded and glanced at True Monarch Tianlan. True Monarch Tianlan smiled and said, "I was right? That kid is reliable." Supreme Tiehu snorted and said, "He is very good. But I thought you would tell Shuang. I didn't expect you to only look for your own disciple. Are you really going to train a successor?" Standing beside Supreme Tiehu, Song Wenji lowered her gaze. But after hearing this, a ray of light flashed across her eyes, and she quickly calmed down. Supreme Tianlan smiled and said, "If I don't train him, why would I take him in as a disciple? As for you, old Tiehu, although you have taken in quite a few disciples these years, I know you are not particularly satisfied with them. Now that you're old, could it be that you want to pass on your legacy to your goddaughter?" Steel Pot True Lord sneered, rolled his eyes, and said, "You talk too much. How I decide on this matter has nothing to do with you." Supreme Tianlan laughed and pointed at Song Wenji. "Let's not talk about other things. This little girl's aptitude is top-notch. She looks good. How about this? If you don't want to marry her, I will ask for your hand in marriage and betroth her to my disciple, Liu Chun. How about that?" Once these words were spoken, the room immediately became silent. Both Taihu deity and Song Wenji revealed a stunned expression. The only difference was Taihu deity looked surprised with some anger, while Song Wenji, with a perfect amount of shyness, in the deepest part of her eyes, a trace of sadness gently flashed past. After a while, Supreme Tiehu snorted and waved his hand to reprimand. "Don't give me that. Don't think that you can push your luck just because you have the upper hand today. Let me tell you, Wenji is my most beloved daughter. She's a priceless treasure to me. Even if you give me the most precious treasure in the world, I won't do it, not to mention giving her back to your disciple as his wife. You'd better give up on this idea." Supreme Tianlan shook his head and smiled. He turned to look at Song Wenji and said, "You are really stingy. You talk big, but why don't you listen what the little girl is thinking? What if she likes my disciple?" As he said this, he drew a big circle in front of him and said with a smile, "Little girl, let me tell you, in the future, all my properties may be passed on to Liu Chun. If you marry him, you won't have to worry about anything for the rest of your life. How about it? Are you willing?" Supreme Tiehu looked a little annoyed, but he seemed to have thought of something. He turned his head and looked at Song Wenji suspiciously, saying, "Wenji, what are you thinking?" Song Wenji bit her lips and knelt down in front of Supreme Tiehu. She said, "Godfather, you have done so much for me. Without you, there would be no Wenji. Wenji has no request. I only wish to serve Godfather for the rest of my life. I only hope that Godfather will take pity on me and not drive me away. Otherwise, I can only be a lonely soul with no one to rely on." At the end of her words, her shoulders trembled and her body trembled. She seemed to be crying as if she was very sad. Supreme Tiehu was shocked. He quickly stood up and helped Song Wenji up. Her face was full of tears, like a pear blossom in the rain. True Monarch Tai, whose face revealed a pained expression as he said, "Why did you do this? Why did you do this? My dear daughter, don't cry. I have no such intention. No such intention." As he said that, he turned around and glared at perfected Lord Tianlan, saying angrily, "You're a perfected lord after all. How dare you spout such frivolous words to scare my obedient daughter?" True Lord Tianlan stared deeply at True Lord Tiehu, only to see him hurriedly comforting the crying Song Wenji. His expression was anxious, and he did not have the bearing of a spirit-severing true lord at all. Supreme Tianlan was amused. He let out a sigh of relief and apologized with a smile. He then stood up and walked out of the house, leaving the godfather and goddaughter alone. True Lord Tianlan looked at the sky as he stood on the long street. Then he looked at the bustling house in the distance and the sounds of fierce fighting that once again rang out. He also heard the comforting words coming from the house behind him. A deep smile appeared on his face. With his hands behind his back, he looked up at the sky. At that moment, he felt that all the living beings in the world were probably just mediocre people. With a flip of the palm, the clouds and rain were overturned. There were few difficult things in the world. Chapter 520. Lu Chun saw the secret door. It was in the back garden of the mansion, under a rockery. It seemed to have blended in with the surrounding rocks and plants. It was almost flawless, and ordinary people would not be able to discover it at all. But it was a pity that the group of people who surrounded this place today were not ordinary people. In the long history of fighting with the devil sect, Fuyunji had long developed from an unknown small sect of Zhengxianming to a huge, terrifying, and even somewhat abnormal powerful organization. In the Fuyun division, apart from the most famous cultivator assassins and the ever-present and mysterious Shadow, there were also all kinds of talents, including astronomy, geography, metaphysics, mechanisms, geomancy, and so on. They had everything you could think of. On such an important day, and also in the Immortals city where the headquarters of Zhengxianming and Fuyunji were located, there was no lack of talents. Therefore, this ingeniously hidden secret door did not hide for long before it was discovered by the people in Fuyunji who specialized in this field. At this moment, the fighting in other places in the house had basically stopped. Although the situation was tragic, blood splattered everywhere. Corpses were everywhere. But the winner was undoubtedly Fuyunji. In the Immortal City, if there was an open battle, the forces that wanted to fight against Zhengxianming and Fuyunji was tantamount to a fool's dream, seeking their own death. As a result, the people of the Floating Clouds Agency had already filled up this back garden. At a glance, one could see a dense crowd of cultivators. Countless of them held blood-stained weapons, and their bodies were covered in blood. Their expressions were either solemn, excited, or ferocious. They all had blood-stained smiles on their faces as they surrounded the secret door. The so-called unable to escape, even if given wings, was probably like this. The entrance of the secret room was very narrow. This was also a common characteristic of most secret rooms in the world, although there were many people in Fuyunji, but due to the terrain, they could not swarm in. Probably because of this, until now, the people in the secret room were still stubbornly resisting. Fuyunji's men rushed in a few times, but the resistance from the people inside was unusually fierce. They managed to repel them several times. Even though they knew that the outside was already surrounded, the people inside didn't seem to have any intention of surrendering. Perhaps they felt that even if they surrendered, there wouldn't be a better result. Although this made the people of Fuyunji a little angry, a few of the leaders revealed a trace of joy in their eyes. It seemed that they had indeed blocked a big fish this time. After fighting for a while longer, Fuyunji's attacks were repelled twice, and some of their players were injured. This time, the expressions of Xue Ying and the others turned somewhat ugly. Lu Chen also walked to her side and said softly, "Don't think too much. If you wanted to die, he would have killed himself long ago. Just use those methods on him and force him out. Shuang pondered for a moment and nodded. She casually waved her hand and summoned a nearby subordinate. Then, she whispered a few orders, and the subordinate immediately turned and ran away. After that, Shuang acted as if nothing had happened. She whispered in a voice that only Lu Chen could hear. "Is the true lord outside?" "Yes, he's outside watching," Lu Chen said. "Oh," Shuang responded, seeming to let out a sigh of relief. Lu Chen smiled at her and didn't say anything else. Not long after, there was a commotion in the crowd in front of them. After a while, it seemed like someone shouted a few words. Then, there was a rustling sound, and an empty space appeared in the middle of the crowd, which happened to be near the secret door. Then 4 or 5 people walked up, each holding a large lump of something in their hands. They slowly walked to a place not far from the door of the secret room. The secret room was silent, and the atmosphere seemed to be somewhat tense. Someone in the crowd suddenly laughed. Then, as if it was contagious, this hearty and mocking laughter suddenly rang out everywhere, vaguely carrying a hint of tyranny. After a while, among the people at the door of the secret room, one of them acted first. He quickly threw 5 or 6 black ball-shaped objects into the secret room from a distance. There was an angry roar in the secret room. But very quickly, almost in the blink of an eye, this angry roar was drowned out by a violent explosion. A blazing flame suddenly lit up, and the orange flame even rushed out of the secret door halfway. A wave of heat rolled and drifted, making it even more difficult to imagine the scene in the secret room. Shuang and Lu Chen's expressions didn't change, as if they didn't have any emotions. But when Lu Chen turned to look, he found that among the Fiyunji experts in the crowd in front, about half of them had happy smiles on their faces. It was probably because of this that Lu Chen quickly found a girl in the crowd who didn't fit in with the others. Su Qingjun stood in the crowd, frowning slightly. She stared at the flames in the secret room for a moment, then gritted her teeth and turned her head away. Then, as if she felt something, she looked in Lu Chen's direction and saw Lu Chen staring at her. Su Qingjun was startled, but in the end, she didn't say anything. She just silently walked backwards. There were no miserable screams coming from the secret room that was filled with flames. After a while, this caused the surrounding Fiyunji people to feel a little restless. Shuang snorted and waved her hand again, as if she was giving an order. The people in front of the door immediately moved, taking turns to walk forward, and then very skillfully threw the things in their hands into the secret room. Thus, in this lonely and despairing secret room, apart from the raging flames, there was also poisonous water, bone-corroding black sand, floating poisonous gas that could rot from the mouth to the lungs, and other things that could make one's scalp go numb and die a horrible death. Seeing this, even the gratified and happy laughter in the surroundings slowly quieted down. Everyone stared at the secret door that no one had rushed out of until now, their faces gradually showing expressions of disbelief. "That's right. Do you keep a dog?" Behind the crowd, Lu Chen suddenly asked Shuang this somewhat incomprehensible question. Shuang was startled for a moment and looked at Lu Chen with some surprise, then said, "No, why?" "Oh," Lu Chen said, "it's nothing. I just wanted to tell you that Sir Iron Pot True Monarch is magnanimous. After I personally asked him, he agreed to take back the dog prohibition order." Shuang was a little speechless and didn't know what to say for a moment. What did this dog prohibition order have to do with today's matter? Right at this moment, an angry roar suddenly came from the deathly silent secret chamber. A moment later, the stone walls around the secret chamber's entrance instantly exploded, shooting out witchcraft gravel and exploding in all directions. In the midst of the chaos, a black silhouette mixed in the gravel shot up into the sky, but it was escaping towards the sky. Lu Chen and Shuang raised their heads and glanced at the sky, but their bodies didn't move at all. The sky was clear and bright, but in the next moment, the sky suddenly darkened. It was as if a hand had suddenly covered the sky, and there was no peace. Chapter 5:21. Covering the sky with one hand. A palm really fell from the sky. It was unimaginably huge, covering the sky and the sun. It was as if at that moment, not only the back garden, but the entire house, the long street outside, and even the nearby large area of the immortal city had suddenly darkened. It was like the wrath of the gods in heaven, with a ruthless and unparalleled power, descending from the sky and suppressing everything. The black shadow that soared into the sky from the back garden suddenly lost all escape routes and was faced with endless darkness. And on the ground, all the Fiyunji experts who had reacted at the first moment and were ready to fly up and intercept the escaping black shadow, at this moment, one by one, stopped in their tracks and looked up at the sky with awe. That tall and burly figure that was like a god, unknowingly, was already standing in the sky, at the peak of the clouds, looking down at the world, high and mighty. The black shadow that originally soared into the sky with a trace of desperation and madness fell into a predicament where there was no way forward or retreat. There was no way up to the sky, and no way down to the ground. In the last moment of despair, he let out a long roar, and used all his strength to collide with the giant palm that was descending from the sky. The wind and clouds suddenly became urgent. The wind whistled from all directions, and the dark clouds in the sky rolled. Suddenly, there was a sound of thunder, and a bolt of lightning that tore the sky apart appeared between the fingers of the giant palm. Like a long white snake, it slithered on the giant palm, and then revealed a ferocious and disdainful grin at the black shadow that was rushing towards it. In an instant, the light of the lightning flourished, and the heaven and earth were silent. The giant palm came crashing down, bringing with it rolling wind and thunder, and slapped on the black shadow that soared into the sky. There was only a roar, and there seemed to be a wave of air that instantly burst forth in midair and immediately rushed towards the surroundings like a huge wave. The giant palm lifted slightly and paused in midair for a moment. And under the shadow of the giant palm, the black shadow, as if it had suffered a heavy blow, its entire body flew backwards like a falling stone, flying diagonally faster and faster. In a short moment, it heavily smashed onto the ground, making a loud sound, and then there was a burst of rustling sounds. The black shadow couldn't control its momentum at all. It tumbled on the ground, smashing through 3 or 4 houses and even leaving a deep mark on the ground. If it was an ordinary person, they would have been smashed into smithereens. However, reality was not like that. But under such a terrifyingly powerful palm, no matter how high the black figure's cultivation was, he was instantly defeated. He fell into ruins and never got up again. The experts of the Floating Clouds Agency, who were originally in the back garden, rushed over. In just a few moments, they had surrounded the black figure. All kinds of dazzling techniques were used, and in an instant, the black figure was suppressed to the point where he couldn't move at all. With that, the outcome was set. The final thief was finally caught. The members of the Floating Clouds Agency all revealed excited smiles. Even more people raised their heads to look at the sky. When they looked at the godlike figure high up in the sky, their faces revealed expressions of reverence. And the bald, burly man above the clouds, at this moment, his expression was calm. He only indifferently glanced at the chaotic situation on the ground, then slowly raised his eyes and looked towards the distant horizon. He frowned slightly, as if thinking about something. On the ground, Xue Ying and Lu Chun, who stood behind the crowd, didn't rush up to surround and interrogate the black figure like the others. Instead, they stood there without moving, their expressions a little strange. After a moment, they seemed to look at each other at the same time, but didn't speak. They just stood there silently. Lu Chun also frowned slightly. This black figure's cultivation was profound, and his strength was valiant. He was a strong enemy that was difficult to deal with. But if everyone's target was the ghost elder who had fought with Supreme Tianlan and Fiyunji in the Immortal City for decades, it seemed to be a little weak. Was the ghost elder only at this level? Or could it be that this time, that crafty and treacherous old turtle was once again hiding in some dark corner, continuing his evil deeds. The battle between the evil cult and the Fuyun Sea was still not over. It was still going to continue painfully like this. In the underground city that was shrouded by the blood-red brilliance of the blood moon, Supreme Guyu expressionlessly walked out from the big house. Standing at the door, he paused for a moment. As if he sensed something, he raised his head and glanced at the sky. What entered his eyes was a strange blood moon that was surrounded by red light and shadows. But his gaze didn't seem to stop at that thing. After pausing on the blood moon for a moment, he looked further away. Passing through the blood moon was a solid and thick rock wall, and further away was the ground of the human world. That place seemed to be another world, and above it was a layer of real sky. The wind and clouds swirled. The person whose power shook the four directions was standing above the nine heavens. Supreme Guyu's expression at this moment became somewhat complicated. He seemed to be deep in thought, and then quietly sat down on the stone steps of the door. In the huge city, on the long and empty streets, there was only his figure, looking like a lone shadow, extremely lonely. The bloodlight floated, sprinkled on his body, and also into the house behind him. In the backyard, separated by a wall, in the dried-up well, a shadow hidden in the deepest part of the darkness slowly moved. He raised his head and glanced at that small well and heaved a long sigh of relief. Then he seemed to hesitate, but in the end he still stood up, using his hands and feet to pat the hard walls of the well. His entire body then quietly climbed up the well wall. There was no sound of wind as the figure moved, no movement at all. This black figure silently and slowly climbed to the mouth of the dry well. The blood moon in the sky sprinkled down blood-red light onto the well, onto his body. The red light floated up and down, like waves in a blood ocean, clustered his figure in the light and shadow. That black shadow let out a low sigh of satisfaction, deeply breathed in this air, that even the smell seemed to carry the stench of blood, and then looked up at the blood moon in the sky, and slowly poked his head out. In the red bloodlight, the face that poked out of the well was impressively a sinister mask. Only the two eye sockets were two holes, and two dark red lights could be seen flickering in them. Not far away, outside the door separated by a wall, Supreme Guyu also quietly sat, looking up as if he did not feel anything. In that small house on the long street of the Immortal City, the doors and windows were opened. Taihu Tru and Song Wenji stood in front of the window and saw the entire scene in the sky. When the gigantic palm with unparalleled power defeated the black shadow that soared to the sky, True Lord Tiehu frowned, while Song Wenji, who was standing beside him, revealed a complicated expression. A trace of reverence first appeared in the depths of her eyes. Perhaps that was the feeling of every cultivator when facing such a powerful force that stood at the peak of the human cultivation world. Then, she revealed a trace of worry, and turned to look at Supreme Taihu Tru. Supreme Taihu Tru seemed to feel the worried gaze of his goddaughter, and turned to her, forcing a smile. Song Wenji was a little hesitant, but finally said in a low voice, "Godfather, Supreme Tianlan, he is very strong." Supreme Taihu Tru was silent for a moment, and suddenly sneered, his face revealing an arrogant expression, and said, "Not bad, but at my level, who cannot do this? This person is frivolous, and purposely wants to show off to the world for an undeserved reputation, and is only SOSO." After speaking, he turned and walked away. Song Wenji took one last look at the figure in the sky outside the house. The corner of her mouth slightly revealed an imperceptible smile, and hurriedly followed Supreme Taihu Tru. Chapter 522. Chun-Hee, who was in the crowd, squeezed through the people around him and walked out. His face was ashen as he turned to look at his surroundings. He quickly found Xue-Ing and Lu Chun, who were standing behind the crowd and had not come over to join the fun. He stood where he was and hesitated for a moment. Then, he walked over with an ugly expression. He even had to take a deep breath to calm himself down before saying to the two of them in a deep voice, "That is not Elder Gue." Xue-Ing and Lu Chun looked at him, and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, Chunyi said, "That person is called Fan Te. He is the leader of the demon sect in the Western continent. He has been doing well over the years and is highly regarded by Elder Gui. He was deployed to the Celestial City with the intention of nurturing and putting him in an important position." Chunyi did not finish his sentence because the outcome was right before his eyes. Clearly, this high-ranking member of the demon sect, Fan Te, was very unlucky. It was an important opportunity for him to achieve meteoric success. However, he had coincidentally encountered a series of heavy blows to the demon sect from Fuyunji. It was naturally impossible for him to achieve his ambitions now. He was even forced to hide here and was eventually captured alive. It could be said that he was unlucky. However, there was no joy on the faces of Lu Chun and Shuang. The two of them looked at each other and saw a hint of worry and disappointment in their eyes. Their most important and biggest target, Elder Gui, who was the key to completely destroying the demon sect. Where was he hiding? Could it be that this sinister and cunning enemy, who had fought with the people of Fuyunji for decades, would still be pestering Zheng Xianming in the Celestial City? Even though perfected Lord Tianlan had clearly held back and did not kill Fan Tue, it was not easy to fall into the hands of a divine transformation stage perfected Lord, someone who had the power to be Zheng Xianming or even the most powerful person in the world. Fan Tue faced this divine transformation stage perfected Lord head-on and was defeated on the spot. Even though he did not die on the spot, his internal organs were shaken and his meridians were in a mess. He fainted on the spot and remained unconscious for 3 days and 3 nights. During this period, Fuyunji had brought people back to Mount Tianlong. Of course, it was not just Fan Tue. There were also other demons from the demon sect that were captured in the house. Harboring evildoers of the devil cult was a serious crime. Of course, the owner of the house had to be held accountable, because it was very likely that the owner of the house was inextricably linked to the devil cult. He might even be a member of the devil cult. Due to various reasons, the original owner of the house disappeared from sight, and all the blame was placed on a man named Lu Hu. Everyone soon discovered that this man had died in that fierce battle in a corner of the house. Then, everything was perfect. The only and had not had the demon sect and had In the end, the demon sect was still weak. Given the situation, those who had escaped would not be able to overturn the situation. After this vigorous but peaceful encirclement, peace was restored on Mount Tianlong. After all, without capturing Elder Ghost, it could not be said that the evil cult had been completely destroyed. Therefore, the original days were still going on, as usual. At most, there were more people in the prison who were prepared to interrogate and investigate. However, in Zheng Xianming, there were still some changes that were discovered. The relationship between the two major factions in Zheng Xianming, the Heavenly Law Hall and Fuyunji, seemed to have eased recently. Although the two high and mighty perfected cultivators in the divinity transformation stage did not show up and directly say anything, smart people and conscientious people were the last things that were lacking in such a powerful organization as Zheng Xianming. They had been paying attention to the situation in the alliance of Immortals all the time, carefully searching for every opportunity and trend that might affect them. And for so many years, the news in Zheng Xianming could not be completely kept secret. Everyone felt that it was like a sieve that leaked information everywhere. In fact, it was indeed a sieve. Speaking of which, it was a very interesting thing. Even if one was as strong as a perfected lord of the soul formation stage, even if his name shook the world and his prestige shook the celestial city, no matter how strong he was or how powerful he was still powerless against things like rumors. This was probably the reason why the human heart could never be controlled. But fortunately, there were too many smart people in this world. Since they could not control the rumors, they would instead add vinegar to the rumors and release more confusing words that made it difficult to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Naturally, they could also make people confused and at a loss for what to do. Therefore, During this period of time, Mount Celestial Dragon looked peaceful, but the rumors in private were like waves, coming wave after wave. Today, it was the Fuyun division that suffered a great loss and was fooled by Elder Ghost, so they didn't manage to catch the culprit. Tomorrow, it was the Lord Tianlan's ingenious plan and meticulous arrangement that defeated the last force of the devil cult in the Celestial City in one fell swoop. The day after that, there was someone who stood out and said with certainty that the reason why this battle was so successful was because Lord Tai, and Lord Tianlan, disregarded their former enmity and cooperated with each other sincerely. As expected, these few deity realm true lords were all great figures who cared about the world and placed the righteous path of the world above all. The rumors were like a mess of flowers, clouding people's eyes. It was hard to distinguish between truth and falsehood. But during this period of time, it was true that perfected Lord Tai, who did not open his mouth to criticize or berate Fuyunji. Those who thought that the two factions had reconciled also used this as evidence. But in this chaos, there was a small matter that did not attract attention. At most, it was a piece of news that people found a little strange and then forgot about after hearing it. It was said that perfected Lord Tai, who had passed down an order to withdraw the dog ban that was previously issued. Most of the cultivators in the world did not keep dogs. Very few cultivators who kept pets had to keep all kinds of different kinds of strange birds and beasts. The remaining number was really pitiful. So, when this dog ban was first issued, although it was surprising, it did not cause too much controversy in the Celestial City. Everyone treated it as if it did not exist. But now that it was suddenly canceled, everyone just listened and laughed. Most people did not care and just thought that it was a sudden impulse of that perfected Lord Tai who. In any case, if you cultivated to the realm of perfected Lord of Deity Transformation, of course you would be qualified to do this. However, only 4 people in this world knew that the reason why perfected Lord Tai, who did this, was because that day in the small house on the long street, after perfected Lord Tianlan and perfected Lord Tai, who had reached an agreement on all the conditions, Lu Chan suddenly and very politely added this condition to perfected Lord Tai who. This suggestion seemed a little rude and unnecessary, but that was what Lu Chan said. And the strange thing was, perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to agree very much. Before perfected Lord Tai, who lost his temper, he smilingly included this request in his own request, and also suppressed perfected Lord Tai, whose temper. So, in the end, this huge pursuit ended silently. There was not much change in Lu Chen's life. The only one who benefited the most was a strong black dog. On that day, the black dog was released and no longer restrained by anyone. It stood in front of the Kunlun temple with a proud and ecstatic expression, barking wildly outside for the whole morning. It was said that the entire Sky Dragon Mountain could hear the dogs barking. Later, the black dog was kicked out of the Kunlun temple by perfected Lord Tianlan and was not allowed to enter again. Chapter 523. Although they did not manage to catch Elder Ghost in that arrest, but this operation was still like giving the evil faction, which was already on its last breath, a heavy stabbing into the heart, hurting into the bones. From that day onwards, the ghost-like shadow that had been floating in the Immortal City for many years finally quieted down. There was no more movement about the evil sect, nor any news related to Elder Ghost. Everything seemed to have sunk into the water, into the darkness, and from then on, there was no more sound. Most of the people thought that the evil sect's power was gone, and there was no turning back. Shui-Ying, Lu Chun, Old Ma, and that Chun-He who sought refuge, all thought so. All the power was wiped out, even if Elder Ghost was still on the run. Even if he still had a little possibility to stir up some waves in the future, but to rebuild the evil sect in front of such a powerful Zhengxiaming was still too difficult. Sky Dragon Mountain calmed down. Of course, that was only on the surface. In the era of prosperity, the undercurrent under the huge organization would never stop. There would always be all kinds of things happening. After eliminating the foreign enemies, It was time for everyone to plot against each other for their own interests. No, it could even be said that this era had already arrived. Everyone was already very familiar with the open and veiled struggles. The only difference was that in the past, there was still Fiyunji. Because of the persistence of Lord Tianlan and some other reasons, he kept chasing and biting the evil sect like a mad dog. Relying on Lord Tianlan's rare talent, relying on Fiyunji's growing strength, and all kinds of ruthless and decisive methods, the evil sect was slowly suppressed, and Zhengxianming won the reputation of the world. Now, it was a new era. It was time to do something else. For example, they would stab their partners who were also allies of the Immortal Alliance and the Righteous Path with a smile, snatch their business, curse them, spread rumors, and then criticize them righteously. In the end, once they gained power, they would kill their friends. Finally, this era had arrived. Have you been waiting for this day for a long time, or have you been resisting for this day to come? That day, when Lu Chun and Lord Tianlan were chatting in the Kunlun Hall, he asked him directly. Lord Tianlan thought for a while, then said with indifference and arrogance, "Never thought about it. Anyway, with my current achievements, it should be others who plot against me, right?" Lu Chun did not believe a word he said. "Nonsense. I don't believe you when you say you don't plot against others." Lord Tianlan laughed and said, "Brat, can't you say something nice?" Lu Chun said, "Oh, Master's kind, humble, and gentle. You should be careful of the people in the Celestial Alliance who have evil intentions and want to harm you. You can't underestimate them." Lord Tianlan clapped and smiled, nodded and said, "Well said." Lu Chun rolled his eyes and said after pondering for a moment, "What should we do next?" Lord Tianlan said, "That old tortoise is hiding somewhere right now and refuses to come out no matter what. It's indeed hard to find, but we can't just give up. Don't bother about this for now and leave it to Shui Ying and Fiyunji." Lu Chun nodded. Lord Tianlan continued, "I have something important that I need your help with, and it has to be you." When Lu Chun saw Lord Tianlan retract his smile and turn solemn at this point, he could not help but be stunned. He sat up straight and nodded. "What is it?" Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced out of the hall and saw a Mount Sky dragon standing tall and majestic under the clear skies. He narrowed his eyes slightly with a deep gaze. After a moment, he said, "Make a trip back to Kunlun on my behalf." The forest was quiet and the wind blew through the majestic mountain. In the quiet hall in the afternoon, there was only a soft and low voice that floated in the hall. It was like a strand of lonely wind that lingered and didn't fade away, and it was telling a secret that no one knew. Atsu lay lazily under the shade of a tree outside of Kunlun's hall. Its dog eyes were half closed, and it looked like it was dozing off. However, when a familiar voice came from afar, Atsu's body quivered, and he immediately opened his eyes. His eyes were bright, and his drowsiness disappeared without a trace. Lu Chun stood on the stone steps and smiled at it, waving his hand. Atsu jumped up and ran over while barking. It rushed to Lu Chun's side and rubbed its head against his body intimately. Lu Chun patted its head and looked back at the majestic Kunlun's hall thoughtfully. A complicated expression appeared on his face. After a moment, Lu Chun said, "Let's go, Atsu. We're going on a long trip." Since they were going on a long trip, it was impossible for them to leave just like that. Lu Chun first returned to his residence and tidied up before leaving for Fiyunji. It had been a long time since Atsu had followed him like this. However, this black dog did not seem to be unfamiliar to him. It ran back and forth and sniffed around, just like before. Lu Chun arrived at Fiyunji's hall and asked someone to inform him. Not long after, he saw Shuang. Shuang smiled when she saw him and said, "I haven't been here for a while. Let me tell you about catching Elder Gouet. That old turtle is really cunning. I really don't know where he is hiding. However, we didn't come out empty-handed. 3 days ago." Lu Chun smiled and waved his hand. "Hall Master Shui, you can make the decision on this matter. I won't interfere. When it comes to dealing with the demonic cult, no one in the world can beat you. Even when Master ordered me to come over a while ago, it was just to help you from the side and help you balance the relationship with the new experts of the Kunlun party." Shuang was slightly startled. Her smile became even sweeter. She covered her mouth and said, "What are you saying? What did you learn to flatter?" Lu Chen laughed heartily and said, "Of course not. All right, I came here today to say hello to Hall Master. The cultivation method that Master passed on to me is quite difficult. In the next few days, I have to go into seclusion in Kunlun's hall. I'm afraid that I can't manage the affairs of the outside world for a while. I can only come and trouble Hall Master Shui." Shuang raised her eyebrows. She then nodded and said, "I see. Cultivation is the duty of us cultivators. Your future is boundless. You carry the expectations of the monarch, so of course you have to put this matter first. As for the other mundane matters, let me handle them. You can rest assured and cultivate." Lu Chen smiled and cupped his hands. "Thank you very much." The two of them chatted for a while and handed over some of the chores during the conversation. Lu Chen then took his leave, turned a corner, and found Old Ma again. He told him exactly what he had said. Old Ma looked very envious. He smiled and said, "Go and cultivate well. Maybe when you come out of seclusion, you will amaze the world with a single brilliant feat." Lu Chen smiled and said, "How can that be possible? Anyway, buy more wine when the time comes. Let's drink together." Old Ma laughed and agreed. Lu Chen left with Atsu. Along the way, intentionally or unintentionally, he passed by the outside of Su Qingjuan's residence. His gaze fell on the door for a long time. But in the end, he walked over in silence. Just like that, he returned to Kunlun's hall. He brought Atsu and sat in a quiet corner. When night came, darkness came from all directions. In the silence, Lu Chen blended into the shadows of darkness that he had not seen for a long time. Chapter 524. There is the sound of even breathing in the darkness. Being immersed in a dream in the quiet night was also a kind of unremarkable, but in fact very beautiful happiness. However, some people were destined not to want this kind of dream. Even in the dead of night, she was like a vigilant kitten, carefully on guard. Once there was the slightest movement, she would immediately wake up. White Lotus was this kind of girl. She quietly sat up in the darkness and turned her head to look out the window. The night was quiet and deep like the sea. There seemed to be nothing but darkness, but it also seemed that behind the dark, deep sea, there were countless shadows and ghosts staring at this place in the middle of the night. White Lotus gently frowned and then turned her head. She heard the steady and quiet breathing of Su Qingjun in the same room. She was still in a dream, quietly and gently sleeping. Although she had encountered those heart-wrenching and painful things, perhaps in the depths of her heart, there was still light. She did not carry too many secrets. Her heart did not have that kind of pressure that can make people go crazy. She lived in her own time, tasting the joys and sorrows of her own life. She slept very quietly and very peacefully. White Lotus quietly looked at her, a trace of envy flashing in her eyes. Then she gently got off the bed, quietly opened the door and walked out. White Lotus walked to the road outside the door. In the quiet night, there was no light in the surrounding houses. Only a few stars in the night sky shone a little light on the world. Bai Lian looked around, then looked in the direction of the Kunlun Hall. In the deep darkness of the night, a tall figure could be vaguely seen standing in the depths of the shadows, like a huge tree that could support the heavens and the earth in the darkness. White Lotus's body trembled, and a trace of fear appeared in her eyes. In that instant, she seemed to have an impulse to turn around and run. But in the end, she still gathered her courage and slowly walked towards the darkness. The mysterious shadow seemed to be guiding this young girl in front. Her elegant and refined, but slightly pale face was particularly eye-catching in the night. The darkness clustered around her, like evil spirits cheering and grinning, entangled, dancing and lingering. The young girl walked further and further away, gradually leaving the house and walked to an unknown hidden place. There was a forest around her, but through the gaps she could still see the majestic Kunlun Temple. It was probably somewhere next to the Kunlun Temple. When the shadow suddenly stopped moving, the forest in the dark night suddenly quietened down. The insects and small animals that should have been under the grass and trees suddenly seemed to be suppressed by some power and no longer made any sound. White Lotus trembled even more violently. Perhaps she had never been so afraid of a person in her entire life, including her master, true Lord Bai Chun, who was once renowned throughout the world and had an unfathomable cultivation. In front of her, the shadows seemed to have covered her entire world. She had completely lost control of her life. Life and death, sorrow and joy, were all in the hands of the shadow. She looked at the shadow, then clenched her teeth and slowly knelt down, bowing her body to express her submission. She did not dare to reveal a trace of hostility and displeasure. With a trembling voice, she said in a low voice, "Martial uncle, are your injuries healed?" A deep man's voice came from the dark shadow, asking White Lotus. White Lotus bowed her head and said, "More or less healed. I was the one who asked Lu Chen to do this. Do you hate me or him?" White Lotus's body stiffened on the ground. Then she said in a low voice with a trace of determination, "No, I don't hate anyone. I did these things willingly." The shadow moved, then slowly turned around. Under the faint light, the tall and burly figure of perfected Lord Tianlan was revealed. Even in such a dark corner, his big bald head seemed to stand out. This man, who stood at the peak of the entire human race, looked at the girl who knelt on the ground and did not dare to raise her head. There was a trace of contempt on his face, but it was unknown whether he was looking down on White Lotus's insincere words or indifferently looking down on all the people in the world. Perhaps he did not even bother to expose White Lotus's insincere words. He just gently waved his hand and said, "You did well last time. You would rather die than resist. It seems that your heart is still honest." Bai Lian's head touched the ground of the forest. Feeling the slightly moist and cold soil, she closed her eyes. After a while, she said softly, "Martial uncle, please do not worry. Bai Lian does not have any other intentions. I only want to be at Martial Uncle's side, to charge and break through the enemy lines for you, and to do my best for your great ambitions. Even if my bones are crushed, I will not regret it." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not comment. His expression was also calm, and it was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. It was also impossible to tell whether he believed White Lotus's words. He just silently pondered for a moment, then said, "Not long ago, I asked Lu Chen to secretly leave the Immortal City and sneak back to Kunlun Mountain to do something for me. If you are willing, you can go with him." White Lotus's body trembled. She raised her head in astonishment, clearly not understanding the intention of perfected Lord Tianlan's sudden request. However, perfected Lord Tianlan did not intend to explain to her at all. He only said indifferently, "If Lu Chen asks, just say that it's my idea. Follow him along the way and chat with him more, provoke his dissatisfaction towards me. If possible, you can also instigate him to secretly harm me. In short, I don't care how sinister and malicious he is. Just go ahead and do it." Bam! White Lotus kowtowed heavily and said resolutely without hesitation, "I don't dare." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at her and sneered. "Do what I ask you to do." White Lotus felt as if her heart was about to jump out of her chest. She was extremely nervous. She stole a glance at the giant, who was as terrifying as a mountain. Then, with a slight tremble, she slowly nodded. "After you return to the mountain, report to me no matter what happens along the way and any reaction from Lu Chen," perfected Lord Tianlan said. White Lotus was silent for a moment before agreeing in a low voice. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look at her anymore and turned to leave. However, he stopped very quickly and said, "There's one more thing. You can follow Lu Chen along the way, but you're not allowed to enter the Kunlun Mountain Forbidden Area." Kunlun Forbidden Area? White Lotus was shocked, but she quickly reacted and lowered her head in agreement. Perfected Lord Tianlan went straight away and did not look back again. Perhaps in his eyes, White Lotus was just a frivolous and insignificant person like a falling leaf. Bai Lian, on the other hand, maintained her position on the ground, and did not move for a long time. After a long while, a sliver of strange joy suddenly flashed across her face in the darkness. She was an exceptionally smart girl. Even though there was a world of difference between her and that person, she could still clearly feel that this person who was so powerful and almost unparalleled in the world still had a weakness. He was too powerful, too smart, and could see through the feelings of the world too thoroughly. His treacherous methods were too thorough. Everyone in the world respected and worshipped him. Who didn't? However, he could no longer easily trust another person. Even though he was willing, liked, cultivated, and chose such a successor, and he wanted to hand over all his properties to him, but he could not control his suspicions. The endless suspicions that he could not completely trust a person. It was a shadow that he could never get rid of in the darkness. It always entangled and followed behind that tall and burly figure like a venomous snake. From time to time, it revealed its sharp, poisonous fangs and dripped transparent but fatal venom. Chapter 525. In the dead of night, darkness shrouded the earth. In the main hall of Kunlun, there was still some light because there were some everlasting lamps that were lit in several places. However, this light was very weak and could not illuminate too far away. It also could not shine on Lu Chen's body. The black dog was lying next to Lu Chen. It did not sleep as it usually did, but looked a little uneasy. From time to time, it would turn its head to look around, but most of the time it would look at the tall lotus throne in the center of the main hall. Although there was no one there at the moment, in its eyes, there seemed to be some vigilance and even hostility. Perhaps the person who sat on it was too powerful, and one day he was annoyed by the dog's barking and kicked it away. In contrast, Lu Chun was much calmer. He sat quietly with his eyes closed from beginning to end. It was not until late at night, when everything was quiet, that he opened his eyes. After looking outside the main hall, he said to Atsu, "Let's go." Atsu stood up, wagged its tail, and trotted towards the door. It did not seem to have any nostalgia for this place, and seemed to dislike it very much. Lu Chen also walked out of the main hall. The few spots of light in the main hall of Kunlun could not extend outside at all, so the darkness rushed in like a tide, crowding him in the shadows. Atsu turned its head to look at him. Perhaps because it was standing in the darkness, Lu Chen suddenly found that its eyes had turned into a light green again. It was a little different from when it came to Immortal City. The color was a little lighter, but it was clearer, like a gem that had a little dust on its surface, becoming more beautiful. He smiled and reached out to touch Atsu's head. Then, he strode down the stairs and walked into the darkness of the night. In the conversation before he left, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already explained most of the things to Lu Chen. As for why he did not personally make a trip for such a confidential matter, Perfected Lord Tianlan also explained the reason to Lu Chen. He said that it was a critical moment in Zhengxianming where undercurrents were surging and danger lurked everywhere. He really could not leave and had to guard the situation here. Once he left the city rashly, a great change would probably occur. To this day, Zhengxianming had almost annihilated the devil cult and the world had submitted to him. Fuyunji's name was known throughout the world, and everyone was in awe of him. Whether it was Zhengxianming or Lord Tianlan, their reputation and prestige were at the peak for the past hundreds of years. But now, Perfected Lord Tianlan said that danger lurked everywhere, but he said that a great change was about to happen. Lu Chen did not refute this, nor did he ask further. He just calmly accepted this strange and important secret mission. Then, after announcing to the public that he was in seclusion, he quietly left the giant city where the center of power in the cultivation world was located. For many years, he seemed to be a person born in the dark. Whenever the night came, he would appear especially like a fish in water and could even do some things that ordinary people could not imagine. Of course, this night, he would no longer transform into the cold, murderous shadow killer in his dusty memory. He just quietly took Atsu and hurriedly left the Immortal City. There were no accidents along the way, and the journey was very smooth. although it was not a particularly gratifying thing. The moment Lu Chun walked out of the Immortal City, he still felt a sense of relief. When he turned his head and looked into the distance, he suddenly realized that the city that was like a giant beast quietly creeping in the darkness of the night, he actually felt a kind of unconsciously tension and pressure every day he was in there. Lu Chun stood where he was for a while and then let out a long sigh. He turned around and called out to Atu, who looked far more excited than he was, who was happily scuttling through the bushes in the surrounding wilderness, sniffing, and jumping madly. Lu Chun was about to continue on his way. But at this moment, Lu Chun and Atsu, who was running over not far away, suddenly sensed something and turned their heads to look at a certain place hundreds of feet away. It just so happened to be the border between the Immortal City and the outside world. Under the dim light and shadows of the night, a few figures suddenly soared into the sky and quickly descended. Then, they started fighting fiercely in the darkness. The sound of weapons clashing, roars, cold snorts, and screams quickly spread out in the oppressive atmosphere. It seemed that a few people were besieging a young girl, and both sides were very fierce and decisive. Every time they attacked, it seemed like they wanted to kill the other party completely. Lu Chun frowned and looked over there for a while. At this moment, Atsu had already run to his side, and after a while, Lu Chun suddenly said in a low voice, "It seems to be White Lotus?" Atsu did not confirm or deny it. He tilted his head and stood there without moving, looking like he did not have the slightest intention of going over to help. Lu Chun thought for a while, and a look of hesitation appeared on his face. This timing was indeed a bit too coincidental. Nothing happened before, nothing happened after, but on the night he quietly left the Immortal City, White Lotus also wanted to leave, and then be discovered and hunted down. After pondering for a while, Lu Chun shook his head, turned around, patted Atsu's head, and said faintly, "It has nothing to do with us, let's go." After saying that, he went straight away and didn't look at the fierce battle in the distance any longer. Atsu snorted, but turned back to look at White Lotus's fierce battle. But no matter how one looked at it, the dog's expression and gaze seemed to be somewhat gloating, as if it kept muttering in its heart, "Die, die quickly." After muttering a few words, Atsu ran away, and after a while, it caught up with Lu Chun in front, wagging its tail and looking particularly happy. A man and a dog walked into the distant night just like that. Cruel and unscrupulous. Bastard. Stinky man. In the midst of the fierce battle, White Lotus felt as if her chest was about to explode with anger. She glanced at the man and dog in the distance, mercilessly turning around and leaving. Then she thought about her mission of chasing after Lu Chun, and how she had even thought about secretly hinting at the possibility of getting along with Lu Chun. She felt extremely wronged. Well, the reason why she thought so was because she was not stupid. She could see that although Supreme Lord Tianlan still did not completely trust his disciple, Lu Chun was, after all, the only disciple he had personally chosen. The fundamental purpose of what he did was actually to dispel her suspicion, and then she could truly trust Lu Chun. Based on this alone, Lu Chun's position in the heart of the damned Baldy was incomparable, because other people didn't even have the qualifications to make perfected Lord Tianlan suspicious. For example, she herself. Perfected Lord Tianlan wouldn't send someone to test her because he didn't care and didn't have the intention to trust her. She knew that Lu Chun's future might really be limitless. She knew that even though she had been a proud daughter of heaven since she was young, and that her talent was unparalleled, all of this seemed worthless in the face of true power and supreme figures. She really wanted to curry favor with Lu Chun, take the opportunity to quickly make friends with him, show kindness to him, and let him take care of her in the future. However, she did not expect that Lu Chun did not intend to come at all. Does he look down on me? White Lotus was a little frightened, and then it turned into anger. The surrounding killers were still fiercely besieging. White Lotus was angry, and her face was as cold as frost. She suddenly attacked fiercely, and at the same time, she gnashed her teeth and said, "Damn Baldy, you sent me to do something, but you didn't tell these lackeys. Are you deliberately messing with me?" Chapter 526. At daybreak, White Lotus finally broke through the encirclement. She was covered in blood as she fought her way out of the encirclement. She had shaken off the pursuers. She was exhausted and her whole body was in pain, but she couldn't care less at this moment. After confirming that she was temporarily safe, her first reaction was to start looking for Lu Chen's whereabouts. However, Lu Chen and the huge black dog had already disappeared without a trace. This was really a very miserable and unlucky feeling. White Lotus was so angry that she almost crushed her silver teeth. But obviously, even if she died of anger, no one would come to collect her corpse. So in the end, she could only swallow her anger and find a secluded forest to hide. Then, she began to treat her wounds and planned to rest for a while to recover her strength before continuing to look for traces of Lu Chen. Fortunately, she knew where Lu Chen's destination was. As long as she followed along the road to Mount Kunlun, she would probably be able to find him. This was also the only hope in this bad luck, but she didn't know when she could find him. Perhaps, when the time came, she could provoke him and make him fall out with Supreme Tianlan, destroying his future, making Supreme Tianlan suspicious of him. And it would be best if he killed him with his own hands. That would be the best. Thinking of this hatefully, White Lotus actually felt a little happy. She took off her coat and began to bandage her wounds. But at this moment, it could be seen that the battle she had experienced last night was really fierce. There were wounds on her front and back, although they were not fatal or too serious. At a glance, the scarred appearance of this teenage girl formed an extremely harsh contrast with her elegant and refined appearance. It also made people want to sigh. Perhaps a beautiful fairy should stand high above the clouds, not eating the food of the mortal world, looking down on all living beings, and being admired and revered by people. And this girl in front of them was probably the unlucky one who fell into the mortal world and fell into the dust. So someone really sighed. White Lotus's body tensed up, and she suddenly jumped up. Her expression was tense, like a fierce and angry little beast. Her eyes were cold and sharp. Looking at the shadow behind the forest, she shouted in a low voice, "Who is it?" The grass and trees shook violently. Then, a black dog ran out from the shadows of the plants. It stood there and didn't come over. It just looked at White Lotus and barked. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, and a trace of astonishment flashed across her face. But somehow, her body slowly relaxed. A moment later, the shadow behind Black Dog shook, and Lu Chen walked out. He stood there and looked at White Lotus. His gaze swept across the wounds on her fair skin. He shook his head helplessly and said, "Do you need my help?" Scram. White Lotus sat on the ground, gnashing her teeth, her body trembling slightly. "I don't need you. Ouch, it hurts to help me." "It's right that it hurts." Lu Chen sat behind her. Like magic, there were a lot of medicine, white cloth, and other things around him. Then, he treated the wound on White Lotus's back. At the same time, he said, "At least they didn't put poison on their weapons. Otherwise, you would be in more trouble." White Lotus clenched her fists. Her face was so pale that there was almost no blood. It was obvious that she was trying her best to bear it. After a few breaths, she said angrily, "In any case, they are people of Zhengxiaming. How can people of the righteous side poison?" "You are wrong." Lu Chen put down the blood-stained cloth in his hand. Then, he took the medicine and gently sprinkled some white powder on White Lotus's wound. White Lotus's body trembled. She sucked in a breath of cold air. Her voice was hurried, and she groaned a few times. But, in the end, she managed to hold it back. Lu Chen put down the medicine bottle and said, "When it comes to sinister methods like poisoning, there is really no one in the world who can compare to us Zhengxiaming. Oh, especially in Fuyunji. That is a place where talents and experts gather. So, you were lucky to be able to escape last night." White Lotus was silent. She did not know why, but her eyes seemed to soften a little. Behind her, Lu Chen saw that the medicine powder had been integrated into the wound. Then he began to treat the other wounds. After a while, he finally finished treating the wounds on White Lotus's back. Although Lu Chen had always been a man with a heart of stone and was used to seeing blood and death, He could not help but frown when he looked at the girl in front of him. After a moment of hesitation, he said to White Lotus, "These wounds are many and deep. In the future, your back may have a lot of scars." White Lotus did not seem to care. She only sneered and did not turn around. She said calmly, "I also have a wound here on my chest. It can't be erased. Do you want to take a look?" Lu Chun was suddenly speechless. He looked a little embarrassed. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He used a white cloth to gently wrap up the wounds on White Lotus's body. After everything was done, he stood up and turned his back to White Lotus. Soon there was the sound of clothes being put on. Lu Chun suddenly saw Black Dog, who was lying not far away, suddenly raise its head and look behind him. Lu Chun glared at the dog. Atsu was shocked. It shrank its head and then lowered its head. Lu Chun was silent for a moment. He said slowly, "You should know in your heart that I will not tell you that I regret stabbing you." The sound behind him stopped for a moment. It was as if White Lotus's movement had stopped for a moment. After a while, White Lotus walked over after putting on her clothes. She looked at Lu Chun and said coldly, "Remember, I will return this stab to you sooner or later." Lu Chun nodded and said, "Okay, I will remember. There are probably no good people in Fuyunji, right?" As she walked out of the forest, White Lotus looked in the direction where she came from. She looked at the vague outline of the giant city and said with disgust. Lu Chun walked past her and said, "The people who surrounded you last night were probably not from Fuyunji. Otherwise, you would have some troublesome things to deal with now. But you are right." He nodded in agreement and said, "I also feel that there are not many good people in Fuyunji." White Lotus looked at him and said, "So after fighting with the demonic order for so many years, you are fighting poison with poison. What about you? You are also a kind of poison, right?" Lu Chun was silent for a moment and said, "I am probably a kind of poison." White Lotus stared at him for a moment. She suddenly could not help but laugh. She shook her head and walked forward. She said, "I don't know why my sure shoe was blind. He actually fell for you and even accepted you as his disciple. I really don't understand." Lu Chun followed, smiled, and said, "Oh, so you don't think I can do it?" White Lotus snorted and said, "You're far worse than me. In terms of birth and talent, aren't I better than you in both?" Lu Chun thought for a moment. He shook his head and did not speak. He only looked into the distance and smiled gently. He then asked, "Oh right, looking at you, could it be that you chased after me last night? What is your intention?" Chapter 5:27. "I'm tired of staying here. I want to go home," White Lotus said. "Go home." Lu Chun was momentarily dazed. After a moment of silence, he said, "I actually forgot that you have a family." White Lotus rolled her eyes, but she soon said somewhat helplessly, "It doesn't matter. I often forget it myself." The two of them looked at each other and laughed. Although they were far from trusting each other, the atmosphere between the two of them eased up a little. Lu Chun didn't seem to have any intention of asking White Lotus's intentions, so he continued walking forward. White Lotus's surname was Bai, and she was born in the Bai clan in Kunwa City, which was at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains. Speaking of which, when Hakushin Jinkuin was still around, White Lotus became his last disciple. However, it was widely rumored that Hakushin Jinkuin was a member of the Bai clan and that he was the Bai clan's biggest backer, which made the Bai clan quite famous for a period of time. However, just like the so-called Tianlan and Tianing, Bai Chen was in fact a Taoist name and not a real name. It was given by Tianlan and Bai Chen's master, Patriarch Tianhong, and not his real name. Therefore, Hakushin Jinkuin had nothing to do with the Bai clan. However, Hakushin Jinkuin's status was too high, so he couldn't be bothered with such rumors. The Bai clan, on the other hand, had an ambiguous attitude. Of course, they didn't dare to spread rumors in public. However, they let it slide from the beginning to the end. They acted like they were wise men and never denied it. They still held the attitude that they would be bastards if they didn't take advantage of the situation. This was no secret in the eyes of those with a bit of status in the Kunlun party. Therefore, Lu Chun never interacted with the Bai clan and didn't have a good impression of them. Back then, when he was suspicious of White Lotus, he asked Olma to secretly investigate them. But in the end, he didn't find anything. White Lotus wanted to go home. The Bai clan was in Kunwu City, so they naturally had to go to the Westland's Kunlun Mountains. When White Lotus turned to ask Lu Chun where he was going, Lu Chun could only helplessly say, "I'm going to the Kunlun Mountains." Since their destination was the same and they knew each other, traveling together seemed to be a matter of course. However, this was only for ordinary people. Lu Chun was not an ordinary person. On the contrary, he had always been different from the others. So, what should have been a scene of the two of them loving each other and walking together didn't happen. Lu Chun said very straightforwardly to White Lotus, "The mountain is high and the road is long. Let's part ways here. Goodbye." With that, he turned around and walked away. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, as if she was stunned by this man. After a while, she came back to her senses. She angrily stamped her feet and chased after Lu Chun to stop him. She angrily said, "What do you mean? What did I do to provoke you? Why are you running away as soon as you see me?" Lu Chun sternly said, "I'm afraid that if I fall asleep in the middle of the night, I'll lose my life at some point." As he spoke, he actually turned to look at the black dog beside him and asked, "What do you think, Atsu?" The large black dog blinked and then nodded vigorously. He looked as if he wanted to raise his tail to show his approval. "You ate those demonic beast meat for nothing." White Lotus scolded angrily and said, "This stupid dog is very stupid. How can you trust it and ask it?" Atsu was furious. It bared its teeth and let out a threatening growl. It looked a little scary. White Lotus didn't even look at it. She just snorted and said, "What are you barking for? If you shout again, I'll let you bleed later." Atsu's neck suddenly shrank as if it was shivering. In fact, Atsu had been reborn after experiencing the southern wilderness and the Great Snow Mountain. It was no longer the same as the weak little mud in the past. However, in the past on Kunlun Mountain, the blood-eating secret method that White Lotus set up was too bloody and terrifying. It probably left a very deep and indelible impression on it. Lu Chun didn't intend to help the black dog that was immersed in its unfortunate memories. Anyway, Atsu would not die even if it was scolded a few times. He just frowned and said, "We'll go our own ways and be at peace with each other. Why do you have to make it so obvious?" White Lotus looked at him and suddenly sneered. "If it's Su Qing-jun, I'm afraid it'll be the other way around. You'll be the one pestering her to go with you, and Shiji, Su won't be willing to go with you, right?" Lu Chun thought for a while and actually nodded, more or less. After hearing what he said, White Lotus lost her temper for a moment. She rolled her eyes and asked Lu Chun, "Why do I feel like you've been guarding against me and suspecting me?" Lu Chun pointed at himself and said, "Do you think I look stupid?" White Lotus said no. Lu Chun said, "All right, then I don't believe you can run out of Immortal City by yourself." White Lotus said, "I'm also very powerful." Lu Chun snorted and said, "No matter how powerful you are, can you be more powerful than the damn Baldy? You're in his hands. As long as he doesn't let go, I don't believe you can run away." White Lotus was discouraged for a moment. Then she sneered, "Look at you calling the damn Baldy. It seems like you're very disrespectful to Lord Perfected Immortal." Lu Chun said, "I'll give him a big head. You can go back and say that to him directly." White Lotus was dumbfounded and looked at Lu Chun as if she was looking at a monster. After a while, she said, "What should I say to him? I was almost suffocated by him. Now that I finally have the chance to come out, I have to take a breather before going back." Lu Chun looked at her from the corner of his eyes and said, "Since you're out, you don't plan to run?" White Lotus was silent for a while and said, "I won't run. I'm afraid I won't be able to escape and will die even faster." Lu Chun frowned and sighed, but he didn't say anything. In the end, the two of them didn't separate and still walked on the road to Kunlun Mountain together. Although White Lotus didn't say why she came, Lu Chun pretended not to know. This was probably because people were tired of living. Atsu was a little dissatisfied with this and expressed it very clearly. However, the two humans ignored it. This made Atsu very depressed. They could only stroll around all day and refuse to go near White Lotus. And White Lotus was also very loyal to her mission and began to ask some questions to Lu Chan from time to time. How old are you this year? Why are you asking this? What kind of magical power do you practice? Do you think I will tell you this kind of thing? How many people have you killed? I can't remember. How many women have you slept with? Is this something a girl like you should ask? How many? Not one. You're lying, right? Who are you lying to? Well, one last question. If you answer me properly, I won't bother you anymore. I'm already very annoyed. Don't ask anymore. Have you ever really fallen in love with a woman? Lu Chun, who was walking, suddenly stopped. After a while, he walked forward in silence. During that day, he didn't talk to White Lotus again. Chapter 528. In fact, most of the time, Lu Chun and White Lotus were not people who were easy to get along with. White Lotus's temperament had been nurtured since she was a child. When she was a child, she must have suffered a lot from the side of the family. But later on, when she was discovered to have a rare, innate talent of 5 pillars, she immediately rose to the sky in a single step and became a treasure loved by everyone. When she was accepted as a disciple by Hakushin Jinkoin of the Kunlun party, she reached the peak of her life. Everyone was optimistic about her, and everyone thought that this girl would have a bright future in the future. Yuanying Jinren was not a problem, and even the position of deity Jinren could be expected. At that time, on one hand, White Lotus had the full support of the Bai clan. On the other hand, she had the biggest backer in the Kunlun party, and on the other hand, she had the eldest senior brother, who was the Jinren of the Kunlun party. Everyone in the Kunlun party, from top to bottom, treated her like a fairy. In addition, she was born beautiful and moving. At a young age, she already had the temperament of a fairy from the 9th heaven. She was the perfect person in the legends. If those things did not happen later, if there was no person called Jinren Tianlan in this world, presumably, White Lotus would really live a fairy-like life. But now, almost all the dazzling halos on her body had faded. Her master was dead, her senior brother had inexplicably gone into death seclusion, and there was another senior brother who was even worse, directly defecting to the enemy. Even the Bai clan, who originally regarded her as the future hope of the family's resurgence and had placed unlimited hope on her, suddenly seemed to have become deaf and blind overnight. They completely forgot about her and almost no longer mention her to outsiders. The situation in this world was so cruel, and the gap was so big. It was already very good that White Lotus had not gone crazy and was still struggling to survive. But now, her temper was really like a thorn. Except for bowing her head to the ground in front of the high and mighty Junren and disregarding her dignity to survive, she was very cold and harsh to others. Even Lu Chun was the same. From time to time, he would mock and make sarcastic remarks. In comparison, Lu Chun seemed to be in a better state. After so many years of suffering and suffering, he had long become tactful. Many times he would smile when he should laugh, and he would lower his head when he should lower his head. But for some reason, he still gave off a cold sense of distance. He was always far away from people, making it hard for people to see his intentions or thoughts. Or perhaps he let you see his intentions, but then you would wonder if what you saw was his sincerity. Almost everyone was like that when they were with him. No one could get close to his heart. White Lotus was like that. Su Qingjun was like that. Supreme Tianlan was like that. And even Old Ma, who had spent more than 10 years with him, was like that. Perhaps it was because of this that perfected Lord Tianlan could not completely trust him. When these two people walked together, it would of course be strange if they could get along with each other in harmony and intimacy. After traveling together for a few days, Lu Chun and White Lotus, who were both smart people, quickly understood this point. But for some reason, White Lotus forcibly suppressed her temper and often took the initiative to talk to Lu Chun every day, but the atmosphere of the conversation was often very awkward. Lu Chun's reaction to this was very straightforward. He had already been in this situation, and the girl opposite him was not someone who could suppress him or directly decide his fate. So, Lu Chun had no interest in dealing with her. even if White Lotus was indeed a rare beauty in the world. Lu Chen slipped away. In the dead of night, he ran faster than anyone else with the black dog. He was so unpredictable that even White Lotus could not catch up with him. She could only curse angrily in the dark night. After returning to traveling alone, Lu Chen took Atsu and traveled over mountains and rivers. After several years, he finally returned to the western continent and saw the familiar majestic Kunlun mountain range. The vicissitudes and changes of the world didn't seem to change the appearance of the majestic mountains at all. Perhaps in the eyes of the heaven, earth, mountains, and rivers, this bit of time was only a blink of an eye. But for some people, that fleeting glimmer was their whole life. Lu Chen did not hurry to climb the Kunlun mountain. Instead, he entered Kunwa City. Of course, he was also very familiar with Kunwa City. Many things had happened here. In addition to the love and hatred of those years, he had actually wandered in this city even earlier when he was still a child. Later on, he was discovered and taken away by perfected Lord Tianlan, which led to the circumstances of his life later on. In all of Lu Chen's memories, Kunwa City was actually the starting point of everything. He started his life here, walking on the familiar streets and looking at the familiar scenery. Lu Chen always had the illusion that everything here had never changed. Not only the streets, shops, and houses, but even the people walking here gave him the feeling that nothing had changed since a long time ago. But this feeling was, of course, wrong. Everything had changed. There were many big mansions in Kunwa City, and the rich and powerful families with a long history all lived here. Along the way, Lu Chen was like an ordinary passerby who saw the lintel of the door and recalled the past. The Bai-clan style was still very grand, but the people in front of the door seemed to have become calm and low-key. The Atsu family was obviously a bit dilapidated. Could it be that the owner didn't have the heart to take care of it? The servants at the door were all listless. Even their gazes when looking outside seemed to be drifting, as if they had lost their vitality. Later, Lu Chen stopped in front of a slightly smaller house. From a distance, he looked at the words, "Immerse," hanging on the lintel of the door. He was silent for a long time before he finally sighed softly. In fact, if he really counted it, it hadn't been a long time since the Xian passed away, but in Lu Chen's heart, it seemed like many years had passed. But as time passed, the smile of that young girl became increasingly clear in his heart. Time didn't wear away her beauty. It just quietly occupied a corner in his heart, looking at him with a smile and quietly accompanying him. Compared to Exen, many things that happened on that soul-stirring night had faded from Lu Chen's memory. The struggle for power, the cruel fighting, the fine line between life and death, and all kinds of things that changed the fate of the world. Everything began to become distant to him. Before coming to Kunwa City, he had already asked Old Ma about Exion's situation after he left. In the end, Exion's body was taken back by her family. Her father still loved her very much, and it was said that he was extremely sad. After taking care of Exion's funeral, he fell seriously ill. Although he didn't lose his life, his body wasn't as good as it used to be. Even now, the cause of Exion's death was still unclear. In other words, the real murderer still couldn't be determined. How ridiculous this may sound, but it is the truth. Someone once secretly said that it was related to the dead son of the Su family, Sumo, but it was quickly denied by the Su family. Sumo's mother, Madame Bai, denied it with grief and indignation. She would rather die than let her son's name be tarnished after his death. Her attitude was so resolute that no one else in the Su family said anything. The Yi family went to the Kunlun party to investigate, but in the end, the matter was left unresolved. The Su family was a great aristocratic family, and there were some particularly outstanding people in the Kunlun party who had connections with several Yuanying enlightened masters, who told them to be a small family that only knew how to grow tea. Even if they had a Yuanying enlightened master in their sect, this wouldn't be the case. However, the Yi family didn't really make a scene because it wouldn't be beneficial to the entire family. Moreover, in some private occasions, some people who couldn't stand it spoke to them. Yexian didn't die unjustly. There were people who were furious for her, people who disregarded everything for her, and people who took revenge for her. Revenge was all that mattered. The dead's wish was fulfilled. The living had to continue living. However, this hatred was buried in the heart and passed on to their descendants. One day it would grow and sprout. That day, Lucien stood outside the E family's door, filled with emotions. He reminisced about the past, but of course, he wouldn't think about the future. He just wanted to see Exine again. To be precise, he wanted to see the wooden plaque with Exine's name. For some reason, Lucien felt a little lost. He remembered how he felt when he returned to Qingshiting village and stood in front of Ding Dong's grave. They were all beautiful women in the world, but they were gone. He didn't catch them when they were alive, so after the separation of life and death, all that was left were memories. He turned and left the street, but he didn't go far. He found an inn to stay in and waited until the sky turned dark. After settling Atsu in the room, Lucien returned to the E family's house and climbed over the wall. Chapter 529. The E family's house was the kind that had been around for many years, but was still very clean and tidy. It was well organized and well arranged. Although it was not as luxurious as the Su families by family, it had its own elegant atmosphere. At the same time, the layout of the house was very clear. Lucien found the ancestral hall at the back of the E family's house without much effort. Most families did not have an ancestral hall. Sometimes, only people with the same surname and clan in a village would have a large ancestral hall to worship their ancestors. To be able to set up a special place in the house, to build an ancestral hall, it was basically a first-class family or aristocratic family. The E family's ancestors had lived a glorious life, so they had left behind a great legacy. There was also an ancestral hall in the house, but it didn't look very big. It was only in a corner of the house. There was a courtyard in a house with green tiles and white walls. When Lucien gently entered the secluded courtyard, the surroundings were quiet. Night shrouded the ancestral hall. Only a few altar lamps could be seen inside the door that was always open according to tradition. Under the dim yellow light, the shadows trembled slightly. On the quiet altar table, there were many memorial tablets with the names of the deceased written on them. Lucien stared at the house for a moment, then walked over. However, just as he reached the door and was about to step over the threshold, his body suddenly paused. He stopped at the door. Under the altar lamps, his face flickered in the shadows. He frowned slightly, and his gaze sharpened. He turned to look at a corner of the ancestral hall. There was a place where the candlelight could not reach, and there was a wooden chair. There was a vague shadow on the chair. It seemed that a person was sitting there. The night was quiet. There was no sound from inside or outside the house. Lucien did not show any fear or guilt. He just stared at the figure. After a while, the shadow moved. Then, a person stood up and slowly walked over to stand under the light. He looked like an old man with gray hair and a thin face. At the same time, his face looked as calm as an ancient well without any ripples, as if nothing could disturb him anymore. Lucien stared at him for a moment. He suddenly realized that the old man's features were somewhat similar to Exine's. He furrowed his brows and pondered for a moment before cupping his hands in salute and taking a step back to show that he had no enmity. Then, he said, "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Senior." After a pause, he added, "Please don't worry, I'm not a thief." The old man was also looking at him. A stranger had suddenly appeared in his own home, but from start to finish, he did not show any expression of surprise or anger. He only nodded and said, "I know. There is nothing in this ancestral hall. If he was a thief, he would not have come here." Even Lucien, who had always been tactful, did not know how to respond. Fortunately, the old man quickly said, "Although our E family is a small family, we still have night guards. You must have amazing divine power to be able to sneak in here without alerting anyone. I wonder what your purpose is, could you please tell me?" Lucien was silent for a moment. "I am here to pay my respects to an old friend. I did not want to disturb your family, so I came here in the middle of the night. I am truly ashamed of my inappropriate behavior. I hope Senior can forgive me." The old man seemed surprised and asked, "May I ask which ancestor of the family you wish to pay your respects to?" Lu Chun hesitated for a moment before answering honestly, "Exing." The old man's body trembled slightly, and his expression changed slightly. He opened his eyes and stared at Lu Chun for a long time before he suddenly thought of something and said, "You? Could it be Lu Chun?" Lu Chun was shocked and nodded. "Yes, who are you? How do you know me?" The old man stared at him for a while and sighed. "Please come in." He turned and looked at the memorial tablets on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, "I am Yiming, Xian's father." In the silent night, darkness shrouded the land. Most people were asleep, except for the ancestral hall in the Yi family's backyard. Two men sat facing each other, talking calmly. "I've asked around about what happened back then. Although our Yi family is no longer what it used to be, we still have a few acquaintances on Kunlun Mountain," Yi said. Yiming said this to Lu Chun. Although he didn't mention any names, Lu Chun understood what he meant. The Yi family was a native of Kunwa City, and one of their ancestors was the great Yuanying master. Even though they were weak now, they still had their ways of gathering information. Melaleuca Japonica, who took great care of Xian, and Dongfang Tao, who took Xian in as his disciple, were already friends. The ancestral hall wasn't a place to entertain guests, so there naturally wasn't any tea between them. They just sat across from each other. Yiming looked at Lu Chun, and after a long moment of silence, he suddenly stood up and solemnly bowed to him. Lu Chun was shocked and hurriedly moved away. "Senior what?" Yiming smiled bitterly. "No matter what, you were the one who avenged Xian back then. The Yi family will always remember this." Lu Chun fell silent. After a while, he said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, I couldn't save her." Yiming shook his head and turned to walk to the altar table in the ancestral hall. His eyes swept over the memorial tablets and finally stopped on the memorial tablet at the edge. He sighed softly and said, "Xian, your friend has come to see you." Lu Chun slowly walked over and looked at the wooden tablet. There was only one simple line of words on it: "Daughter, Xian's memorial tablet." At that moment, his lips moved, as if countless memories of the past suddenly surged into his mind. Scene after scene flashed past, and then silently dissipated. He turned his head and looked at Yiming with a pleading gaze. Yiming sighed, nodded, and moved aside. Lu Chun picked up 3 incense sticks from the altar and lit them on the altar lamp. Green smoke floated into the air, creating a dreamy scene. He stared at the memorial tablet behind Qin Yan, as if he could see the bright, kind, and cheerful young girl from back then. A moment later, he held the incense stick in his hand and respectfully bowed 3 times to Xian's memorial tablet, then inserted it into the incense burner on the altar table. The ancestral hall was silent. Only the green smoke floated in the air. Thinking back to one's life, one would probably become like this green smoke after death. He stood there for a long time before bowing to Yiming. "Thank you for your help, Senior. I cannot thank you enough. Since my wish has been fulfilled, I shall take my leave now." Yiming nodded. "The Yi family will remember your kindness. If there is anything we can help you with in the future, please don't hesitate to ask." Lu Chun smiled, but shook his head. It was not a good thing to be related to him. He cupped his hands at Yiming and left the ancestral hall. He leaped into the air and flew into the deep darkness. In the distance, the majestic mountain of Kunlun seemed to be opening its chest in the darkness to welcome the arrival of this stranger. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.